What would you do if a stranger showed up at your door on the worst night of the year? Soaking wet, trembling, and holding a box filled with a dead man's secrets? What if that dead man was your best friend? And what if everything inside that box proved you'd been lying to yourself for years? This is the story of a man who had everything money could buy and nothing worth waking up for. A woman who had nothing left but one final promise to keep, and a friendship so powerful it refused to end even after the grave. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The storm came in the way bad news always does. Quietly at first, then all at once. By 8 o'clock, the ridgeline above Crestwood Hills had disappeared completely behind a wall of dark cloud, and the rain was no longer falling so much as hammering. Sheets of cold October water that bent the tree line along the property and turned the long gravel driveway into a shallow river. Lightning split the sky somewhere to the west, close enough that the thunder arrived less than 2 seconds later, rattling the floor-to-ceiling windows of the main house like something was trying to get inside. Landon Pierce stood in front of those windows with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched. He was 32 years old, and in almost any measurable way, he had won. The house, 12,000 square feet of custom stone and dark timber set into the hillside above the Monongahela Valley, was paid for outright. So were the 2 properties in Pittsburgh, the warehouse complex in Cranberry Township, and the logistics company that had made him wealthy enough to buy all of them before his 30th birthday. His name appeared in regional business press with the kind of regularity that publicists charged good money for, and he'd never hired one. Pierce Logistics had survived a recession, a global supply chain collapse, and one very expensive divorce, and it had come out of all 3 bigger than it went in. On paper, Landon Pierce had no problems. In practice, he was standing alone in a room large enough to park 6 cars, watching a storm roll over a valley he could see for 40 miles on clear days, and the only thing he felt was the specific, exhausting weight of a silence that never seemed to lift. He raised the glass, put it back down without drinking. Through the hallway at his back, the house breathed the soft sounds of itself, the tick of the heating system, the low percussion of rain against the skylights on the upper floor, the faint mechanical hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. His daughter, Macy, had been asleep since 7:30. She was 6 years old, and she slept the way children do when the world hasn't yet taught them to lie awake worrying, which meant she was out cold, probably twisted sideways across the bed with one arm hanging off the edge, her stuffed rabbit on the floor beside her. She did that every night. He checked every night. It was the only reliable ritual he had left. Landon pressed 2 fingers to the cold glass of the window. Outside, a stand of white oak trees along the north edge of the property was bending hard, branches whipping, leaves tearing free and plastering against the window in dark, wet shapes before being swallowed by the dark. He'd bought this property because of the view. Right now, he couldn't see 20 feet. He turned away from the window, set the bourbon on the mantel above the stone fireplace, and was in the process of deciding whether to just go to bed at 8:15 on a Thursday like a man with no remaining dignity when the knock came. Not the doorbell, not the chime of the security panel at the front gate. A knock, fist against solid wood, 3 times, uneven, like the person doing it wasn't sure they had the right house but was desperate enough to try anyway. Landon stopped moving. His security system had not announced a vehicle on the drive. The gate at the bottom of the hill required a code or a buzz-in from the house. He'd paid a lot of money for that system specifically so that nobody could appear at his front door without warning, and yet here was someone at his front door without warning. He crossed the room in 8 strides, pulled up the security panel by the entry hall, and checked the exterior cameras. The front porch camera showed a figure, small, hunched, dressed in a dark jacket that had long since stopped being waterproof. The figure had both arms wrapped around something, a box of some kind, rectangular, held against the chest, and was standing with shoulders pulled up around their ears against the cold and the rain. The hood of the jacket was up, but the wind kept throwing it back, exposing dark hair plastered flat against the sides of a face that was turned slightly downward. A woman. Landon stared at the screen for a few seconds longer than was necessary. She knocked again, same 3 knocks, same hesitation in the middle, and this time she looked up at the camera directly, which told him she'd spotted it, which meant she wasn't trying to hide. Her face on the small screen was pale, rain-streaked, and wore an expression he recognized after a half-second of trying to place it. Not danger, not desperation in the sense of someone about to do something he'd need to be concerned about. She looked like someone who had driven a very long way and was not sure they should have made the trip at all. He disengaged the deadbolt and opened the door. The cold air hit him immediately, and with it, the smell of wet earth and something else. Something almost metallic, the particular scent of a storm that has been building for hours. The woman on his porch flinched backward slightly when the door opened like she'd half expected it not to, and then she looked up at him. She was around 30, maybe a year or two either side. The kind of face that would have been pretty in better circumstances. Structured, with dark eyes that were in the process of deciding whether to hold their composure. Her jacket was a gray outdoor shell that had once been decent quality and was now faded at the seams, and her jeans were soaked from the knee down. Her boots, brown leather, worn through at the toe on the right foot, had standing water in them. He could tell by the way she shifted her weight. In her arms, pressed against her chest with both hands, was a box. A wooden box, old, painted a shade of blue that had mostly worn off to reveal the pale wood beneath. It was roughly the size of a shoebox, sealed with a simple metal clasp, and whoever had painted it had done it by hand. He could see the brushstrokes, uneven, careful, the work of someone painting something they cared about rather than someone in a hurry. He'd never seen that box in his life. He'd seen that paint color before. Not the box, just the color. The particular soft blue that Dylan Hart used for everything he made with his hands. The color he'd mixed himself in the garage of his parents' house in Morgantown when they were both 19 years old, the same summer they'd driven to Pittsburgh to watch the Pirates lose 3 games in a row and thought it was the best week of their lives. Landon hadn't thought about that color in 2 years. Now he was looking at it in the hands of a stranger on his front porch in the middle of a storm, and the skin on the back of his neck went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. "Mr. Pierce," the woman said. Her voice was steadier than she looked. "My name is Emma Hart. Dylan was my husband." The silence between them lasted maybe 5 full seconds, which is longer than it sounds when you're standing in an open doorway with rain coming in sideways and a storm bending the trees on your property, and a stranger has just said the name of your dead best friend. Landon said nothing. Emma Hart didn't push. She stood where she was, holding the box against her chest, watching him with those dark eyes that had decided, apparently, to hold their composure after all. "Dylan talked about you," she said. "A lot, actually. I felt like I knew you before I ever saw a photo." Landon stepped back from the door. "Come inside," he said. She hesitated. Just for a moment, the smallest pause, like she needed to confirm to herself that she was actually doing this. And then she stepped through the door, leaving wet boot prints on the dark stone floor of the entryway. He closed the door behind her. He brought her a towel first, and while she was drying her face and hands in the main hallway, he went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because he didn't know what else to do with his hands, and because it seemed like the kind of night that called for something hot. She hadn't asked for anything. He hadn't offered. He just did it. By the time he came back, she had folded the towel neatly over the back of the entryway bench. An instinct so automatic she probably wasn't aware of it. The instinct of someone who had spent years being careful about other people's things. And she was standing in the great room looking at the view through the windows. There was nothing to see, just rain and darkness and the faint ghost of the valley below, but she was looking at it anyway, still holding the box. She turned when she heard him come in. "You should sit," he said, and then added, "You're shaking," because she was slightly, which could have been the cold and could have been something else. She sat on one end of the long couch, the box in her lap. He took the chair across from her, the leather one he usually read in, the one that faced the fireplace, and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "How long was the drive?" he asked. "About 3 hours, a little over." She glanced down at the box, then back at him. "The last 40 minutes were... The storm caught me on Route 19. I had to pull over twice." "You drove 3 hours in that." "I've been meaning to come for a while," she said, and something in her voice shifted slightly on the word meaning, a small compression, like a word that had been carrying a lot of weight for a long time. "I kept putting it off, then I stopped putting it off." "How long has it been?" he asked. 14 months, Emma said. "Since the accident." He already knew how Dylan had died. He'd been at the funeral in Morgantown. He'd stood in the second row, behind Dylan's mother, and stared at the front of the church while the pastor said words he couldn't hear over the sound of his own thoughts, telling him that this was wrong, that it was impossible, that Dylan Hart was 30 years old and had the physical constitution of a man who would live to 90, that you couldn't die on a Tuesday in September on a highway you'd driven 200 times. A semi, they'd said. Overcorrection on a wet road. Dylan's truck had been in the wrong place. He had not reached out to Emma after the funeral, which was something he had never been able to explain to himself in a way that satisfied him. He told himself it was giving her space. He knew, in whatever part of himself where honest things lived, that it was something else. Cowardice, maybe. Or the specific paralysis that comes from knowing you should do something and not being able to make yourself do it, because doing it makes it more real. He'd sent flowers. That was the entirety of his contribution to Emma Hart's grief. She didn't appear to be here to make him feel guilty about it. That wasn't what was in her face. "I found the box," she said, "when I was going through the storage unit last month. Dylan had a storage unit in Morgantown. I didn't even know about it until his mother mentioned it. She gave me the key." She pressed one hand flat against the lid. The box was on a shelf in the back. He'd left a note taped to the outside. She paused. The note had your name on it. She placed the box on the coffee table between them, the way you'd place something you'd been carrying for too long and were relieved to finally set down. The clasp was a simple hook-and-eye latch. She didn't open it. That wasn't her job. She'd brought it here, and now it sat between them on the glass table like a small, patient, hand-painted fact. "I read the note," she said. "Not the letter inside, just the note on the outside. It said—" She stopped, and he watched her jaw tighten briefly and then release. It said, "For Landon. He'll know what to do with this. He always figured things out before I did." A sound escaped Landon that he hadn't intended. Not quite a laugh. Not quite anything else. Because that was Dylan. Exactly Dylan. The precise pattern of his speech. The way he distributed credit to other people like he had too much of it and needed to get rid of some. He'd always figured things out. Dylan had believed that sincerely, and Landon had never had the heart to tell him that half the time he was just faking confidence until reality cooperated. He reached out and unhooked the clasp. The lid opened on a small brass hinge. Inside, the box was lined with what had once been green velvet and was now flattened to a smooth, dull surface, the fabric of a jewelry box repurposed for something else. There were 3 items inside: a sealed envelope, cream-colored, thicker than a single sheet of paper. His name was on the front in Dylan's handwriting. Blocky, left-leaning, the handwriting of a man who was always writing faster than he was thinking. 2 composition notebooks, the cheap kind, black and white cover, edges worn soft, stacked flat beneath the envelope, and a photograph tucked against the side of the box. Old, printed on actual paper, slightly faded. 2 men in their early 20s, standing in front of a pickup truck on a gravel road somewhere in Pennsylvania, both of them squinting against sunlight, both of them grinning like idiots. He picked up the photograph. He remembered that day. Fishing trip. North of Punxsutawney, up near one of the reservoir access roads, the summer after they'd both graduated. Dylan from West Virginia University, with a construction management degree he'd gotten by showing up to every class, even when he was sick. Landon from Carnegie Mellon, with a logistics degree and a business plan that 3 different professors had told him was too aggressive. Dylan had caught 2 fish that day. Landon had caught nothing, which Dylan had found deeply satisfying for reasons Landon had pretended to find annoying but actually found endearing. "You okay?" Emma asked quietly. "Yeah," Landon said, which was not entirely accurate. He set the photograph down and picked up the envelope. Book. He didn't open it immediately. The kettle had started making noise in the kitchen, and he went to deal with it and came back with 2 mugs of tea that neither of them had discussed, and he set hers on the table next to the box, and she wrapped her hands around it and didn't say anything while he stood at the edge of the fireplace and looked at the envelope for a moment longer. "You don't have to read it tonight," Emma said. "I didn't bring it with any expectations. I needed to bring it. It felt wrong to keep it." "He addressed it to me, and you kept it for 14 months. "I know." She looked at the table. I opened the storage unit and I looked at the box and then I locked the unit back up and I didn't go back for 3 weeks. She paused. Grief makes you irrational about small things. I wasn't ready for whatever was in it. I needed to be ready first. He understood that better than she probably expected him to. He opened the envelope. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten on lined paper, the lines overcrowded with Dylan's slanted script. The margins were filled with additions, arrows pointing to afterthoughts, small bracketed jokes, corrections where he'd crossed out a word and written a better one above it. It looked the way Dylan had always written, like someone trying to say too much at once who had made peace with the fact that he was always going to run out of page before he ran out of things to say. Landon read it standing up, which he hadn't planned. He'd planned to sit. He just didn't. Dylan had written the letter approximately 6 months before he died, according to a date in the top right corner, March, 2.5 years ago. He had no reason to think he was going to die. He'd been 30 years old, in good health, recently married, planning a bathroom renovation. He had written the letter because, he explained in the first paragraph, in the slightly defensive way of a man who is doing something sincere and feels the need to pre-explain it, he'd had a scare the previous winter, a health thing that turned out to be nothing. And the 2 weeks of waiting for results had clarified certain things for him. And one of the things it clarified was that there were things he wanted to say to certain people that he had not yet said. And since Dylan Hart was nothing if not a man who acted on the things he knew he should do, he had sat down at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning and written those things down. I want you to know that I know, Dylan wrote halfway through the first page. The whole reason you started your business is so you'd never have to depend on anyone. And the whole reason you can't stop working is because stopping means thinking. And the whole reason you can't think is because thinking means feeling. And the whole reason you can't feel is because feeling means admitting that you've been lonely for a long time and you don't know what to do about it. I know because you're my best friend, and best friends see through everything. You're also the most aggravating person I've ever known, and I say that with complete affection. Landon exhaled slowly through his nose. After the divorce, Dylan continued, I kept waiting for you to call and actually tell me what was happening. Not the facts. I had the facts. You told me the facts. Very efficiently, like you were briefing me on a logistics problem. I mean, tell me what was actually happening. You never did. I let it go because you needed to let it go in your own way, and I respected that. But I need you to know that I saw it, and I see it now. You've been building walls around a wound for 3 years and calling them structure and focus and being a good father. And I'm telling you as your oldest friend that Macy deserves a father who is actually present, which means you have to actually be present, which means you have to stop running. Landon put the letter down on the mantel, picked it up again. Now. The other thing I wanted to tell you, I've been keeping notebooks. Emma thinks they're project journals. She's not wrong exactly, but they're more than that. They're a list of things I want to do, things I want to do for people, not big institutional things, specific things, the stuff that doesn't get done because it doesn't have a budget line and nobody's getting paid to care about it. I've got a neighbor, old guy, Vietnam vet, lives alone. His porch has been rotting for 2 years and he can't afford to fix it. I've got a family down the road from my mother's house. 3 kids, single mom, lost her job in January, about to lose her heat. I've got a dozen things like that, Landon, a dozen specific, real, fixable problems, and all they need is someone who gives enough of a damn to show up. Here's the thing I need you to understand. I'm not asking you to give money. I know that's your instinct. Write the check, solve the problem from a distance, keep your hands clean. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking you to show up. I'm asking you to do it yourself. Because I think you've forgotten what it feels like to do something hard with your hands and your time and your actual presence. And I think that's part of why you feel like you're disappearing. If you're reading this, it means something happened and I didn't get to do these things myself. So do them for me. That's my ask. That's the only inheritance I have to give you, which is saying something since you're the one with money. Don't make it weird. Just fix the porch. Your best and most tolerant friend, Dylan P.S. I left the notebooks in the box. Emma knows where it is. She's the organized one. P.P.S. She's also the one who kept me from making every bad decision I ever talked myself into making. So if she has opinions about how you should do this, you should probably listen to them. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to a low orange glow by the time Landon reached the end of the last page, and the storm outside had shifted from its furious peak to something steadier and quieter. Still heavy, but no longer angry. Rain on the windows, constant, a soft percussion. He stood at the mantel for a long moment. Emma had not said anything while he read. She'd drunk half her tea and sat with her legs curled under her on the end of the couch and watched the fire, giving him the privacy of her silence, which was a complicated thing to do for a stranger, and he was aware of that. He turned around. Her eyes came to his immediately, which told him she'd been paying attention even without watching. He wrote this 6 months before the accident, Landon said. I figured. The date on the notebooks matches. He was writing a lot that spring. He never told me about the notebooks. He never told me what they were for exactly. I knew he had them. He wrote in them at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings, usually. He'd sit there with his coffee and write, and if I asked what he was doing, he'd say planning, and then he'd look pleased with himself. Something almost like a smile crossed her face, quick and fragile, and then it was gone. That was very Dylan. Yeah, Landon said. He set the letter down on the coffee table beside the box and looked at the 2 composition notebooks beneath where the envelope had been. He reached in and picked them up. They were heavier than they looked. Both full, pages fat with ink, edges soft and slightly wavy the way paper gets when it's been handled a lot. He put them back in the box. I'm sorry I didn't reach out, he said. After the funeral, I should have. Emma looked at him for a moment, and he braced slightly for whatever was coming. He'd said the line, and he deserved whatever the response was. But she just shook her head. It was a bad time, she said. For everyone. I don't need an apology. I'm giving you one anyway. Another of those brief, difficult, almost smiles. Okay. He sat down in the chair again. Not the reading posture, not the leaning forward with elbows position, just sitting. Tired, suddenly. The particular tiredness that comes not from physical effort, but from feeling things you've been not feeling for a while. He thought you'd fix the porch yourself, Emma said. That's what the notebooks are for. He didn't mean for you to hand someone a check. I know. Can you? She said it without judgment, a real question, genuinely curious. I mean, do you know how to do that kind of work? Landon looked at her. I haven't used a circular saw in probably 8 years. I'm probably terrible at drywall. I built a bookshelf once in my mid-20s that a structural engineer would have condemned. That's not a no. No, he said. It's not a no. She stayed another hour, not because either of them planned it, but because the storm wasn't letting up, and because the letter had opened something that needed more than 30 seconds of conversation to close back down. They talked about Dylan, not the death, the person. The way he'd argued with his mother about the Steelers every Thanksgiving. The way he'd once spent 3 days building a birdhouse from scratch because someone online had said it was easy, and he'd taken that as a personal challenge. The way he laughed, too loud, from the gut. The kind of laugh that made other people laugh just by proximity. Emma told him that Dylan had proposed to her at a picnic table outside a diner in Morgantown at 7 in the morning, because that was when he'd thought of it, and he didn't believe in waiting when he was sure about something. She said she'd been eating a breakfast sandwich, and she'd told him she'd think about it, and he'd said, no, you won't, and she'd said, you're right, yes. And they'd finished their breakfast like nothing seismic had just happened. Landon told her about the summer they'd worked construction together before college, running deliveries and doing grunt labor for a general contractor in Pittsburgh who'd worked them like rented mules and paid them barely enough to cover gas. He told her about the time Dylan had talked their supervisor into letting them frame an entire interior wall by themselves on a Friday afternoon, just to prove they could, and how they'd finished it 40 minutes before the end of the day and the supervisor had walked over, looked at it for a long time, and then said not bad and walked away, and how that had felt to both of them like a standing ovation. He never told me that one, Emma said. He probably forgot. He did things and then forgot them. He had a very short memory for his own accomplishments, and a long memory for everyone else's. Yes, Landon said. The fire had gone fully cold. The storm was still coming down, but no longer pushing against the windows the way it had been. Emma uncurled herself from the couch and stood, and Landon stood with her, and they went through the motions of departure: coat, box, keys located in the pocket of the soaked jacket. At the door, she paused. "I have a room," Landon said. "It's late. The roads aren't— I booked somewhere in Canonsburg." She held up her phone. "It's 10 minutes from here. I'll be fine." He didn't argue. She held the box out to him. The blue box, the green velvet inside, the notebooks, the photograph, and the now folded letter. He took it. "I'll contact you," she said, "about the first one. In the notebooks. If you decide you want to do it." "First one?" She tilted her head. "The porch." He'd forgotten somehow in the middle of everything that this was supposed to end in action. Not in a conversation about birdhouses and construction summers and a fishing trip 20 miles north of Punxsutawney. "Right," he said. "The porch." "There's contact information in the front of the first notebook," Emma said, "for the man who lives there. His name is Walter Greer. He's 74. Dylan checked on him sometimes." "How did Dylan know him?" "Through his mother. She brought him groceries." She pulled her hood up. "He's been trying to get the porch fixed for almost a year. He can't navigate the back steps safely, and the side door doesn't seal properly, which means his heating bill has been—" She stopped. "Sorry, I've read those notebooks a lot." "Don't apologize. I'll be in touch," she said. She stepped out into the rain, and he watched from the doorway as she walked down the front porch steps, careful on the wet stone, and across the drive to a small silver sedan that had been sitting there for 3 hours, soaked down to its axles, patiently waiting. He watched her taillights disappear down the gravel drive. Then he closed the door, went back to the great room, set the box on the coffee table, and sat down on the floor in front of it, which was not something he did. Sitting on the floor, it wasn't a habit, and opened the first notebook. Dylan's handwriting. Everywhere. Dates, addresses, small sketch diagrams, prices scrawled in the margins, quick notes in the shorthand of a man who trusted his own memory to fill in the blanks. The first page had a name and address at the top, underlined twice. Walter Greer, 412 Fenwick Road, outside Bealsville. Porch needs full rebuild. Front steps rotting, left side rail missing, side door gap. Draft issue. Not safe. Fix this. And then, in smaller writing below, circled, "He won't ask for help. Nobody ever asks. That's the whole problem. You have to just show up." Landon sat on the floor of his 12,000 square foot house in the dark with the box in his lap and the storm outside, and his daughter asleep upstairs, and his dead best friend's handwriting in front of him. And he stayed there long enough that his back began to ache, and the clock on the far wall reached 11:15. He didn't move. He was reading. He didn't sleep that night. Not properly, anyway. He made it upstairs around midnight, checked on Macy. She had migrated entirely off the bed and was somehow sleeping on the floor with the stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, which was concerning in the way that children are constantly concerning. He lifted her back onto the mattress without waking her, pulled the blanket up, stood there for a minute watching her breathe. Then he went back downstairs. He sat at the kitchen table with Dylan's notebooks until 2 in the morning, then until 3. The storm had thinned to a steady gray drizzle by the time he finally closed the second notebook and set it on top of the first, and the kitchen had gotten cold because he'd forgotten that the heat in this part of the house ran on a timer, and he'd never bothered to learn how to override it. He made a second pot of coffee he didn't need and sat with it cooling in his hands, and thought about what Dylan had written, which was not the same as thinking about the words themselves, but the person behind them. The fact that Dylan had sat down at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning in March, healthy, employed, newly married, with no particular reason to think about his own mortality, and had spent what was probably several hours writing 4 pages to a man he'd known since they were 18 years old. Not to say goodbye. Not to leave instructions. Just to say the things he'd always meant to say and kept not saying because there was always more time. Except there wasn't. Landon had known that intellectually for 2 years. He knew it the way you know any abstract fact. You can recite it, you can nod at it in conversation, you can use it to justify buying the expensive bottle of wine or taking the vacation you keep postponing. But reading Dylan's handwriting at 2 in the morning in a kitchen that was slowly getting cold, knowing that Dylan had been sitting at his own kitchen table doing the same kind of late-night thinking on a spring night when he was 30 years old and had no idea. That was a different kind of knowing. That was the kind that sits in the chest rather than the head. He went to bed around 4, slept badly, dreamed about nothing he could remember. When Macy came downstairs at 7:15, bright-eyed and asking about waffles with the unsentimental authority of a small child who has identified a single morning goal and intends to achieve it, Landon was already up and had already made the coffee and was standing at the window watching the valley below emerge from the overnight clouds into a pale, washed-out November morning. "Daddy," she said from the kitchen doorway. She was wearing one sock and carrying the rabbit, and her pajamas had a small tear at the knee that he kept forgetting to sew. "Waffles." "Good morning to you too," he said. "Good morning. Waffles." He made the waffles. She sat at the counter and ate them with syrup she applied herself, liberally and imprecisely, and told him about a dream she'd had involving a horse that could talk and a library that was also a swimming pool. And Landon listened and asked the right questions and refilled her orange juice and was, in all observable ways, a present and functional parent. But a part of his attention was elsewhere, in the direction of the blue box sitting on the coffee table in the other room, and the 2 composition notebooks inside it, and the name written at the top of the first page in Dylan's handwriting. Walter Greer, 412 Fenwick Road, outside Bealsville. He won't ask for help. You have to just show up. "Daddy," Macy said. "Yeah." "You're doing the face." "What face?" She scrunched her nose in demonstration, which he supposed was meant to be an impression of him thinking too hard, and which was accurate enough to be slightly embarrassing. "Sorry," he said. "What were you saying about the horse?" She told him again about the horse. He listened better this time. Autumn. He called Emma Hart at 9 o'clock, after Macy had been delivered to school, and he'd driven back up the hill and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. She picked up on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake. "I want to do the porch," he said, without preamble. "The first one. Walter Greer." A brief silence on her end. "Okay." "I'm going to need help. I haven't done that kind of work in years, and I don't have tools here, which is embarrassing to admit." "You could hire someone." Dylan specifically said not to write a check. "He did," Emma said. "I know." Another pause. "I have some experience with renovation work. My husband and we worked on our own house for 2 years. I know my way around a project." He hadn't expected that. "You'd want to be involved." "I drove 3 hours in a storm to give you those notebooks," Emma said, and her voice was dry but not unkind. "I didn't do that to hand it off and go home." "Fair enough." He thought for a moment. "Can you come back up this weekend? I want to go see the property first, just to understand what we're dealing with." "Saturday works. I'll text you the address." "I already have it," she said. "It's in the notebook." He called Walter Greer on Friday afternoon, which was harder than it should have been, which told him something about himself he didn't particularly enjoy knowing. The number was in Dylan's notebook, written in pencil below the address, and Landon had looked at it several times over the previous 2 days without picking up the phone. He told himself he was waiting for the right time. He knew he was stalling. When he finally called, the phone rang 7 times, and he was composing a message in his head for when it went to voicemail when the line clicked, and a man's voice came through, low and a little rough. The voice of someone who'd spent decades outdoors and didn't particularly modify their tone for phone calls. "Yeah. Is this Walter Greer?" "Who's asking?" Landon had prepared an explanation for this, a simple and truthful one, and he'd rehearsed it approximately 4 times in the car. He said it now, that his name was Landon Pierce, that he'd been a close friend of Dylan Hart, who had passed away the previous year, and that Dylan had left detailed notes about certain people in the community who could use some assistance, and that one of the things he'd specifically written about was a porch that needed repair, and that Landon would like to come and take a look this weekend, with no obligation, just to see what was needed. He got through about half of this before Walter Greer interrupted him. "You're telling me my porch is in some dead man's notebook?" "Yes, sir. That's essentially correct." A long pause. Landon heard the sound of a television in the background and something that might have been a chair moving across a floor. That was Dylan Hart's notebook, the Hart kid, from over in Morgantown? He grew up in Morgantown, yes. His mother brings me soup, Walter said. In the winter, she brings soup. He mentioned that. Another pause, this one different in character, more considering, less suspicious. Porch has been bad for a while, Walter said finally. Left front step went all the way through last February. I've been using the back. Back steps aren't much better. He paused. You know what you're doing, building-wise? Not as much as I'd like, Landon said, but I have someone with me who does. Walter made a sound that wasn't quite agreement but wasn't refusal. Saturday morning, before noon, I'm not up for the afternoon. We'll be there by 9. Fine, Walter said, as though he was granting a minor concession under duress, which Landon suspected was more or less true. Then he hung up without a goodbye, which somehow felt like the most honest thing that had happened all week. Emma arrived at 7:30 Saturday morning, which was 30 minutes earlier than they'd agreed on, which he learned was her default. She arrived 30 minutes early for everything, a habit formed from years of working jobs where being late had consequences, and then preserved long after the consequences were gone. She was driving the same silver sedan, which in the gray morning light he could see was a few years older than he'd initially clocked, the kind of car that was well maintained because its owner couldn't afford to let it slide. She had brought coffee in a travel thermos, which she offered without comment, and she was dressed for work. Worn canvas jacket, jeans, actual work boots rather than the beaten leather ones from Thursday, boots with steel toes and laces that had been replaced recently. She'd pulled her hair back. She looked like someone who intended to get something done. In the bed of Landon's pickup, he'd bought a truck 3 years ago because he'd told himself he'd use it, and had used it approximately 4 times. He'd loaded a toolbox he'd ordered on overnight delivery from a hardware supply company. 2 levels, a measuring tape, a pry bar, and 3 different types of lumber he'd bought based on a list he'd found online that described general porch repair and which had turned out to be not quite the right list, he'd discover later. Emma looked at the lumber, then looked at him. Did you read the dimensions in the notebook? She asked. I read the entry. He listed the board measurements in the margin. He had not seen that. I didn't. I'll look again. It's fine. We'll measure when we get there. Most of this is probably returnable. He was not sure, standing next to his truck on a Saturday morning with the wrong lumber and a toolbox he'd ordered on the internet, that Dylan had fully thought through his confidence in Landon's practical abilities. But Dylan had rarely let reality modify his confidence in people once he'd decided something, and Landon supposed that was as much a feature as a flaw. They took Landon's truck. Emma drove because she said she knew the way from Bealsville, and Landon's truck's GPS was out of date, and they'd end up on a road that had been closed since 2019. This turned out to be true on both counts. It took them about 40 minutes down the valley and then west on roads that got progressively smaller and less maintained until they were on a 2-lane that wound between bare-limbed trees and brown fall fields, and the few houses they passed were spaced far apart and sat back from the road behind long gravel drives and wire fences. Emma drove the way she spoke, efficiently, without unnecessary noise. She handled the truck better than Landon did, sitting straight, both hands on the wheel, occasionally glancing at the side mirror out of pure habit. He noticed small things about her that he hadn't. Thursday night, a scar on her right hand, small and white, along the knuckle of her index finger, probably from a blade or a sharp edge at some point. A callus on her left palm that suggested she'd done a lot of gripping work, tool handles or rope, or something similar. The way she was quiet in a way that was full rather than empty, like someone who'd learned that silence was a resource rather than a problem. Did you sleep? She asked, around the 30-minute mark. Not much. You? Not much either. She glanced out at a field they were passing, frost still white in the low corners where the morning sun hadn't reached. I keep picking up the notebooks and putting them back down. There's a lot in there. 13 entries, Landon said. I counted. 14. There's one on the last page of the second notebook, written vertically in the margin. You have to turn the book sideways to read it. He hadn't found that one. What is it? A family in Uniontown, single mother, 3 kids. He wrote. She stopped for a moment. He wrote, "Winter is coming, and the furnace is old, and she won't ask." Same thing he always wrote. They won't ask. Landon looked out the window at the frost in the field corners. He paid attention, Landon said. He always did. She said it simply, without weight, the way you say something that is just true and requires no decoration. They turned down a narrower road, unpaved, and came to a mailbox with the number 412 on it in stick-on numbers, one of which was slightly crooked. Walter Greer's house was small and white and had seen better decades, but someone had taken care of it in the ways available to them. The gutters were clear, the windows were clean, the front yard had been raked recently, even though it was November and the oak in the yard was still dropping leaves. A rusted flag holder on the front wall held an American flag that was faded but intact. Flower beds along the foundation, empty now, but edged, maintained, waiting for spring. The porch was another story. Dylan had not been exaggerating. The front steps, 3 of them, wooden, leading up to a covered porch about 12 feet wide, had given up. The bottom step was gone entirely, broken through at some point and removed, leaving a gap of about 8 inches you'd have to step over. The middle step had a crack running diagonally across it that had been widening for a long time and would finish the job inside another winter. The left front corner post of the porch roof was sagging, pulling the railing down with it, and the railing itself had a section missing on the right side, just a gap where boards had been removed or had fallen and not replaced. The porch floor itself, Landon could see it from where he was standing because the missing step section gave a clear view, had soft spots visible from the ground, the particular dark discoloration of wood that was holding water it shouldn't be holding anymore. It wasn't just cosmetic. The whole front approach of the house was functionally hazardous for someone who was 74 and living alone, and had been for long enough that the man inside had simply adapted around it, using the back, navigating his own property like an obstacle course. The front door opened. Walter Greer was a narrow man in his mid-70s, about 5'10", with white hair cut short and a face that had been outdoors for decades, deeply lined, with a permanent squint built into it from years of working in sun and wind. He wore khaki work pants and a flannel shirt and had a slight favoring of his right leg that wasn't quite a limp but was getting there. He stood in the doorway and looked at the 2 of them, and then at the truck, and then back at them. "You're Pierce," he said, addressing Landon. "Yes, sir." His eyes moved to Emma. "Emma Hart," she said, "Dylan's wife." Something moved in Walter's face, a small compression, the particular expression of someone who has absorbed a hard fact more than once and still hasn't found a way to make it land softer. "Hart's wife," he said. "I heard about what happened. I'm sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Emma said, and she said it the way she said most things, directly, and without the elaborate minimizing people sometimes do when they're uncomfortable with sympathy. Walter looked at the porch. "Well," he said, "there it is." "Can we take a closer look?" Emma asked. "Watch the second step," Walter said, and then appeared to reconsider. "Actually, go around the side. Gate's open. Back steps are better." They went around the side of the house, through a wooden gate that squeaked on its hinges, and came up onto the porch from the back access. The porch was deeper than it looked from the front, wrapping around from the main entrance, and from up here, Landon could see what he hadn't been able to from the ground. The extent of the soft rot in the front section of the floor, and the fact that the corner post wasn't just leaning, it was splitting, the wood grains separating in a slow-motion failure that had been in progress for a couple of years at minimum. Emma crouched and pressed on a board. Her hand sank slightly. "This whole section will need to come up," she said, indicating about a 6-foot run of decking near the front. "If there's rot in the joists, we'll have more work." "There's rot in the joists," Walter said from behind them. He'd come around and was standing at the top of the back steps, hands in his pockets, watching them with the wariness of a man who has had people inspect things before and not liked what followed. "Man from the hardware store came and looked 2 years ago. He said it was a full rebuild. Front section, posts, steps, the railing. Gave me a number that I didn't have." "What number?" Landon asked. Walter told him. Landon didn't react. The number was not large, measured against what Landon spent monthly on things that mattered to him considerably less than whether a 74-year-old man living alone could safely access his front door. Emma was measuring the front run with a tape, pulling it out and noting numbers in a small notebook she'd produced from her jacket pocket. She measured the step gaps, the post height, the railing sections. She did it quickly and precisely, with the focus of someone who had done this kind of assessment before and didn't need to narrate it. Walter watched her. "You know what you're doing," he said finally. "Not a question." "My husband and I rebuilt a deck," Emma said, still measuring, "and 2 interior wall sections, and a bathroom." She straightened. "He was better at the finish work. I was better at the structural part." "He teach you?" "We taught each other," she said. "He found a book. We argued about the book for about 3 weeks, and then we did the project, and the book was right about most of it." Walter's expression shifted very slightly, in a way that might have been the beginning of something warmer. "What was it wrong about?" "The concrete footing section," Emma said. "The spacing recommendation assumed soil conditions that we didn't have. We figured it out, but it added a week." Walter made a sound that was almost an approval. Landon stood slightly to the side of all this, watching, and understood that he was witnessing something he had not managed in the 5-minute phone call on Friday. The establishment of Walter Greer's trust. Not because Emma had credentials or references, because she'd argued with a book about concrete footings, and she spoke about construction the way people speak about things they've actually done with their hands, with the specific small frustrations and adjustments that don't make it into any book. Walter turned to Landon. "You going to help or just watch?" "Help," Landon said. "I'm better with logistics than I am with a saw." "Well, that's honest." Walter looked back at the porch. "When are you thinking of starting?" "Next weekend," Emma said. "If that works for you." Walter was quiet for a moment, looking at the rotted corner, the missing rail section, the steps that had been failing for 2 years while he went around to the back every morning. He'd adapted. He'd figured out how to navigate his own property around the problem because there was no other option, and he wasn't the kind of man who sat down and waited for help that wasn't coming. "Fine," he said. Same tone as the phone call, granting a concession. "I'll make coffee." "You don't have to," Emma started. "I'll make coffee," Walter said again, in a tone that ended the discussion and went back inside. They spent another 40 minutes on the property, measuring, photographing, Emma sketching a rough materials list in her notebook while Landon held the tape and called out numbers. He was not useless at this. He was slower than she was, and he asked questions she found obvious, but he absorbed the answers quickly and didn't ask the same thing twice, which she appeared to register and appreciate. On the drive back, she read out the revised materials list while Landon drove, and he called his hardware supplier from the truck and placed an order that would arrive on Thursday, which the supplier found unusual. Most people called for residential lumber with at least 2 weeks lead time, but Landon had been using this supplier for his business for 4 years, and the urgency was accommodated without much discussion. "You do know people," Emma said after he hung up. "I know supply chain people," he said. "That's a specific kind of knowing. It's useful here." "Dylan knew I'd figure out that part," Landon said. He called it out specifically, said he wasn't asking me to give money, but the money is only one part of how I actually help. He paused. "He thought of everything." "He thought of everything except not dying," Emma said, and her voice was flat when she said it, not cruel, just the flat voice of someone stating a fact they've had 14 months to fail to get used to. Landon didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say. They drove for a while without talking. "He was right about you," Emma said eventually. "I didn't know what to expect. From the letter, I knew who you were to him, but people are different from how other people describe them." "And?" "You listen," she said. "He said that too, actually. He said you had a way of paying attention that made people feel like what they were saying mattered." He was generous with his assessments. "He was accurate," Emma said, and the way she said it, without elaboration, was the kind of compliment that didn't leave room for deflection. Landon looked at the road. "He was right about me hiding," he said after a moment. "What he wrote in the letter. He was right." Emma didn't respond immediately. She looked out the side window at the brown fields and the bare-limbed trees and the occasional farmhouse set back from the road. "I know," she said finally. "He told me. Not everything," says she. He was private about it, about you, but he said once that you were the kind of person who built things around yourself to avoid having to feel things, and that it worked right up until it didn't. What did you say? I said that sounded like a lot of people. And? He said, yeah, she said, but it's worse when the person is also genuinely good, because then they use the good things they do as the walls, the work, the fatherhood, all real, all meaningful. But also armor. Landon tightened his hands on the wheel slightly, not from anger, but from the specific discomfort of hearing yourself described with complete accuracy by someone who loved you and is no longer there to say it in person. He was smarter than he got credit for, Landon said. He knew that, Emma said. He just didn't care much about credit. She leaned her head back against the headrest and closed her eyes, not sleeping, just resting, the particular rest of someone who has been awake in the wrong ways for too long. Outside, the November countryside moved past, gray and cold and bare, and Landon drove back toward Crestwood Hills with the 2 composition notebooks on the back seat and a materials order confirmed for Thursday and a name written in pencil on the first page of the first notebook. Walter Greer, 412 Fenwick Road. That had already done something to him that he couldn't quite name but could definitely feel, something that sat somewhere between obligation and purpose and wasn't entirely comfortable as either. The following Saturday, they started work at 8 in the morning. Landon had arranged a sitter for Macy, his neighbor's daughter, a college student who had watched Macy before and was reliable, and driven out to Buellsville with the truck loaded with materials and tools, arriving to find Emma already there, standing in Walter's front yard with 2 cups of coffee from a gas station down the road, wearing her work boots and the canvas jacket and a wool hat he hadn't seen before, talking to Walter on the porch like they'd known each other for years. They hadn't. She'd been there 15 minutes. It was a quality he'd observed in Dylan, too, the ability to make a conversation happen naturally, without forcing it, the way some people just find the right level to talk to someone on without trying. Walter had been skeptical on Saturday morning, and now he was telling Emma about the previous owners of the house and what they'd done to the gutter system that he was still dealing with, which was a remarkably specific complaint to share with someone you'd met twice. Walter looked up when Landon's truck came down the drive. "You're late," he said. Landon had arrived 30 seconds after 8. He checked his watch. This was accurate. "I'll do better," Landon said. Emma handed him a coffee. They started by pulling the damaged front steps apart, which took longer than Landon expected because the original builders had fastened them with a combination of nails and construction adhesive, and the adhesive had done its job so well that separating the boards required more force and more colorful language than a quiet November morning in a rural area really called for. Walter sat in a lawn chair he'd positioned off to the side, watching, occasionally offering observations about the construction choices of the previous owners that were not complimentary. "Who used adhesive on exterior steps?" Emma said, at one point, flat and directed at no one. "The kind of man who knew he was going to sell the house," Walter said. Emma made a sound of agreement and applied the pry bar with renewed conviction. Landon was doing what he could, hauling debris, handling the saw cuts that Emma marked but needed someone with more upper body weight to execute, holding boards in position while she drove screws. He had been honest about his skill level, which was below hers in most categories. But he was strong and he was quick, and when she told him what she needed, he did it without complicating it, which she appeared to find more useful than he would have expected. They worked through the morning. Walter made coffee twice. At noon, he brought out sandwiches, plain, white bread, efficient sandwiches made by a man who had been feeding himself alone for a long time. And they sat on the tailgate of the truck and ate and didn't say much, which was its own kind of ease, the ease of people who've been working alongside each other and have found a rhythm. "My wife used to do the front garden," Walter said, looking at the empty flower beds along the foundation. He said it the way he said most things, without particular preamble, a fact offered into the air. "Every spring, she had names for all of them. The plants. I never learned the names. I just helped her dig." Neither Landon nor Emma said anything. Both of them understood that the comment wasn't a request for response. "She's been gone 11 years, Walter said. "You stop noticing some things. Other things you notice more." He took a bite of his sandwich. Front porch was always hers. She liked to sit out there in the evenings. I kept meaning to fix it. He looked at the work they'd done that morning. The old steps gone. The front section of decking pulled back, fresh pressure-treated lumber stacked and ready for the afternoon. 11 years of meaning to, he said, not bitterly, just factually, the way a man states a thing he's made his peace with, even if the peace is imperfect. Emma looked at the flower beds. What was her name? She asked. Ruth, Walter said. Ruth Eleanor Greer. She went by both. Never just Ruth, never just Eleanor. Always Ruth Eleanor, like it was one word. He was quiet for a moment. She would have liked you, he said to Emma. She liked people who worked. Emma looked at the flower beds for a moment longer. Then she finished her sandwich and climbed off the tailgate and went back to work, and Landon followed her, and Walter sat in his lawn chair and watched them rebuild the front of his house on a cold November Saturday, and nobody said anything else about Ruth Eleanor Greer, but the name was in the air for the rest of the afternoon. They finished the steps and the front deck section that day, and the corner post, and half the railing. The other half would take another weekend and another trip, which Landon had already planned for. By 4:30, the light was going fast the way it does in late November, draining out of the sky from the top down, and they were cleaning up, tools boxed, scraps bundled for disposal, sweep of the front walk, when Walter came to the door. He stood there for a moment looking at the front of his house. The new steps were straight and solid, pressure-treated, properly fastened. The corner posts no longer leaned. The railing section on the left was complete, plumb, and firm. It was not finished. There was painter's tape on exposed ends. One section of decking still had the original boards where they'd run out of time. But the front steps worked. You could walk up them. They held. Walter put his hand on the new railing. He pressed down on it. The railing didn't move. He pressed down again, harder. Nothing. He stood there with his hand on the railing and didn't say anything for long enough that it stopped being awkward and became something else. And Landon found himself looking away. At the truck. At the tree line. At the bag of debris by the drive. Anywhere except at a 74-year-old man standing on his own front steps touching a railing like it was the first solid thing he'd felt in a while. Same time next Saturday? Emma asked. Walter's hand came off the railing. He cleared his throat. Coffee'll be hot, he said. He went back inside. Landon and Emma loaded the truck in the near dark, working by the light of a headlamp clipped to the tailgate, and when they were done, they stood there for a moment in the cold quiet of a November evening in rural western Pennsylvania, breath visible, the house behind them warm and lit, the new lumber pale and clean against the older boards that still needed work. That's the first time he touched the front railing, Emma said quietly, since we got here. I know. She looked at the house for a moment. Dylan would have been insufferably smug about this, she said, and her voice cracked, very slightly, in the middle of the word insufferably, and she pressed her lips together and looked at the sky. He would have, Landon agreed. She laughed. A short, wet, real sound, the kind that happens when grief and something else are sharing the same space and one of them breaks through unexpectedly. She turned away and got in the truck, and Landon got in on his side and they drove back toward the main road in the dark without saying much. But the silence on the way back was different from the silences before it. Not empty, not heavy, not the particular silence of two strangers navigating a strange situation. It had the texture of something shared, something that had happened to both of them that afternoon and that neither of them needed to explain to the other because they'd both been there when it happened. Landon drove. The road unwound ahead of them in the headlights. In his jacket pocket, folded once, was the page he'd torn from the first notebook that morning before leaving the house. Dylan's handwriting. The entry for Walter Greer, with the address and the notes about the porch, and the note at the bottom that he'd read 6 times by now. He won't ask. Nobody asks. That's the whole problem. You have to just show up. He hadn't shown up in 2 years. He was showing up now. It was not redemption. It was not a transformation. It was one afternoon of work on one man's porch in one corner of western Pennsylvania. He was still a man who had avoided his own life. He still had 11 more entries in those notebooks. He still had the specific problem of being someone who had built something large and impressive and hollow, and had been living inside the hollow part. None of that had changed. But something had, in some smaller and more stubborn way. Walter Greer had put his hand on that railing, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately track, Landon Pierce felt like he had done something that mattered. Not because it was profitable, not because it was strategic, not because it reflected well on him in any external sense, but because an old man who missed his wife could now walk up his own front steps without thinking about falling. That was all. It was enough for one day. The second Saturday, at Walter Greer's house, they finished the railing. It took until 2 in the afternoon, partly because the corner section required a different bracket configuration than Emma had anticipated, and partly because the morning had started with the discovery that one of the remaining original deck boards had concealed a joist underneath that had softened further than either of them had realized during the initial assessment. Soft enough that Emma pressed it with the heel of her boot and her foot went through the wood to the ankle, which produced a short, startled sound from her and a longer, more elaborate reaction from Walter, who had been watching from the doorway with his coffee and appeared to take the near injury as a personal insult delivered by his own property. "I knew that joist was bad," he said, as Emma extracted her boot from the hole with some dignity and a great deal of mud. "I knew it. I told the man from the hardware store 2 years ago." "You were right," Emma said, checking her ankle, which was fine. "I'm usually right about the things that are going to cause problems," Walter said. "Less helpful than it sounds." They pulled the board and replaced the joist. It added an hour and a half and a trip to the hardware store 12 miles down the road, which Landon made while Emma stayed and kept Walter from attempting to help by redirecting him into a conversation about the history of the property, which turned out to be a subject Walter had opinions about and was willing to discuss at length. When Landon came back with the lumber, Emma was sitting on the tailgate of the truck and Walter was on the new front steps, using them naturally, without thinking about it, the way you use something sound, and they were talking about a family that had owned the land before the current house was built, sometime in the 1930s, and a flooding event that had changed the course of a small creek that ran along the back property line. Landon unloaded the lumber. Neither of them paused their conversation to acknowledge him. He found this oddly satisfying. By 2 o'clock, the front porch was done. Not in the way that renovation magazines would photograph it. The paint on the posts was peeling, and they hadn't touched that, and the porch light fixture was original to the house and had a crack in the glass cover that Walter had taped with electrical tape at some point in the past decade. The flower beds along the foundation were still empty, and the siding behind the left corner needed attention it wasn't going to get today. But the structure was solid, the steps were plumb, the railing ran unbroken from one end to the other and didn't flex when you put weight on it. Walter stood on the porch and walked the full width of it, his hand trailing along the railing from left to right, and at the right end he stopped and looked out at the yard and the road and the empty fields beyond. "Ruth used to put a chair right here," he said, "right at this end. She liked the afternoon light." He was quiet for a moment. "I've got a chair in the garage I've been meaning to bring out." "We can get it," Landon said. "I can get my own chair," Walter said, in the tone that shut that down. And he went inside and came back 2 minutes later carrying a wooden armchair that had once been painted green and had faded over years of garage storage to a dusty sage. And he set it at the right end of the porch in the exact position he'd described, and he lowered himself into it with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints registered every cold morning, and he looked out at the yard. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Emma and Landon were loading tools into the truck, keeping their backs to the porch, because that felt right, because some things need to happen without witnesses even when the witnesses are the reason the thing can happen at all. "Come back in the spring," Walter said finally, from the chair. "The beds along the front need digging out. I can't get down that low anymore." Emma looked up. "We'll come back in the spring. I'll have coffee." "We know," Landon said. They drove back in the early dark, the heater in the truck working harder now that December was close. The fields along the road turning from brown to the flat gray of a Pennsylvania November evening. The sky, the particular color of cold iron that means the season has made its commitment and is not reconsidering. Landon had been thinking about something since the morning, since the moment Emma's boot had gone through the joist, and the whole plan for the day had reorganized itself around an unexpected problem. And the way they'd handled it, not a discussion, not a negotiation, Just an immediate and practical redirection had felt like something he wanted to name. "We work well together," he said. Emma looked out the window. "We do," she said, not surprised, not modest about it, just agreeing with a fact. "I've been thinking about the other entries, in the notebooks." He kept his eyes on the road. "The way Dylan wrote them, there's more than we can do in a weekend here and there. Some of these are big projects. The family in Uniontown, the veteran in Waynesburg, There's an entry about a youth center in Connellsville that he described as needing full renovation." "I know," Emma said. "I've read them all." "I'm not sure this works as a weekend hobby," Landon said. "I'm not saying that to back out. I'm saying if we're going to do this properly, it needs to be organized differently." Emma turned from the window and looked at him. In the dashboard light, her face was half shadow, half pale glow, and she had the careful expression of someone who has been waiting for a conversation without being sure it was going to come. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "But I'm thinking it." Stimmt. He thought about it for 2 weeks. He thought about it while he was in meetings he could have delegated. He thought about it while he was driving Macy to school and listening to her explain an argument she'd had with a classmate about whether penguins could theoretically live in Pennsylvania if the weather got cold enough, which was the kind of question she approached with the earnestness of someone who fully expected reality to make exceptions if the logic was sound. He thought about it at night, after Macy was asleep, and the house was quiet, and the valley below disappeared into December fog. He pulled the notebooks out 3 times and read through them again, not for the details. He had most of those memorized, but for the voice. Dylan's voice on those pages. The way he wrote fast and honest and never bothered with preamble. The way he described people's situations with practical specificity and then always ended with the same note, the same refrain. They won't ask. Nobody asks. That was the thing Dylan had understood that most people's generosity didn't account for. Not the reluctance of people to accept help, which everyone understands in the abstract, but the active, practiced, learned silence of people who have spent long enough being failed by the expectation of help that they've stopped waiting for it. They don't ask because asking has cost them before, because they've learned to adapt around what's missing, because pride is sometimes the only thing left that's fully their own. Walter Greer hadn't asked. He'd been going around to the back door for a year. He'd put a chair in the garage. Dylan had noticed, written it down, planned to show up. Landon got on the phone with Emma on a Tuesday evening, the second week of December. "I want to make it formal," he said. "An actual organization. Non-profit structure, probably. Fiscal management, volunteer coordination, a system for identifying and vetting projects." A pause on the line. "Okay," Emma said. The notebooks become the foundation. Dylan's entries are the first projects. After that, we build a referral network, our local churches, community health workers, veteran services, schools. People who see the situations before they become crises. "That's a real thing," Emma said. "Building that network takes time." "I know. I'm not in a hurry." He paused. "I'm also not the right person to run the day-to-day operations. I can fund it. I can handle the logistics infrastructure. I can use my contacts to get materials and labor donated. But the ground-level coordination, you want me to run it," Emma said. Not a question. She'd heard the shape of what he was building and identified where she fit. "I want to ask if you'd consider it," he said carefully. "It's a real job. It pays. I'll pay you properly, not charity rates. I know what your situation has been." The silence on the line lasted long enough that he thought he might have misjudged. "You know," Emma said finally, "for the first 6 months after Dylan died, I applied to 41 jobs. I counted them. Retail management, project coordination, property admin. I got 7 interviews and no offers, and then I stopped counting because the counting was making it worse." She paused. "The last 4 months I've been working at a grocery distribution warehouse in Morgantown. Evening shifts, 3 nights a week. It keeps the lights on." He hadn't known that. She hadn't told him, and he hadn't asked, which he recognized as another failure of the same kind as not calling after the funeral. "Emma, I'm not telling you that for sympathy," she said, and her voice was firm, not hard. "I'm telling you because you said you know my situation, and I want you to actually know it, not the version you're imagining." A beat. I'll do it. The job. But I need to understand what the structure looks like before I commit, because I'm not interested in being involved in something that collapses in 18 months because the money got complicated. Fair, he said, and I want editorial authority over the projects. Which ones we take, how we approach them. I'll defer to you on the financial side. You defer to me on the community side. Agreed. And we name it after Dylan. He had been going to suggest that. He was glad she'd said it first. The Hart Foundation, he said, or something close. Dylan Hart Memorial Fund sounds like a funeral, Emma said. He would have hated it. He would have. What then? She was quiet for a moment. He used to say, whenever he was about to do something he wasn't sure he could do. He'd say forward, then figure it out. That was his whole strategy for everything. I know, he said it when we were 20 and about to frame that wall. Forward, then figure it out, Emma repeated, the way you repeat something to hear how it sounds. Something with forward in it. Heart forward, Landon said. A pause. Yeah, Emma said. That's it. It took 2 months to do it properly, which was faster than his attorney advised and slower than Landon's instinct preferred. There were forms and filings and board structure requirements and IRS applications and 100 procedural things that had to exist before the thing could formally exist. And he handled most of that through his legal team while Emma began the quieter, slower work of mapping the landscape, driving through communities in the southwestern Pennsylvania counties, making phone calls, introducing herself to the social workers and school counselors and veterans, outreach coordinators who saw the gaps every day and had no mechanism for filling them. She was good at it. Not in a slick professional development seminar way. She was good at it the way people are good at things they're constitutionally suited for. She listened without interruption. She asked specific questions. She didn't promise what she couldn't deliver, and she remembered details. She could follow up 3 weeks later with the exact name of the woman someone had mentioned in passing, the exact circumstance, the specific type of help that was needed. People felt taken seriously because she actually took them seriously. She moved from Morgantown in January. Landon had a guest house on the property, a small, separate structure near the tree line at the back of the land, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, its own entrance, and he'd offered it as transitional housing at minimal cost, practically nothing, while the organization got established. She had hesitated on that, not because she didn't need it, but because accepting it felt like a line she needed to think about crossing. It's not charity, he'd said, and then immediately recognized that this was exactly what Dylan had said would be his instinct, to reframe things until they sounded like transactions. Actually, it is partially charity, he'd corrected, but it makes operational sense too. We're going to be in the field together constantly, and the logistics are better if you're not driving 4 hours round trip every time we need to talk through something. I'll pay rent, Emma said. Small, but real. I'm not living somewhere rent-free. Fine. And I'm not eating your food. I wasn't offering. Good. She moved in on a Saturday in January with a rented trailer and a storage unit's worth of things, and Landon helped carry boxes in the cold because it seemed like the minimum required behavior, and Macy followed them between the guest house and the trailer approximately 19 times, asking questions and offering observations, including a detailed assessment of which of Emma's boxes were the heaviest based purely on how red Landon's face got when he carried them. That one, Macy said, pointing at a box labeled books, as Landon came down the trailer ramp at a pace that suggested she was correct. Thank you, Macy, he said. You're welcome, she said pleasantly. Emma, carrying a smaller box, looked at Macy with an expression that was cautious and warm in equal parts. The expression of someone who likes children but is being careful not to assume things about what role she's supposed to play here. Macy looked up at her. Are you going to live in the small house? I am, Emma said. Our house is bigger, Macy said, in the tone of someone noting a geographical fact. It is, Emma agreed. Daddy's house is big because he was sad when it was just him and me, Macy said, and the absolute matter-of-fact delivery of a 6-year-old who has been listening to things adults thought were private conversations landed in the cold air of the trailer's threshold, and nobody said anything for a second. He said it to Grandma on the phone, Macy added helpfully, establishing her sourcing. Landon set the books box down. Macy. What? Let's take the next box. Macy went for the next box. Emma looked at the guest house door and didn't quite smile, but something in her posture shifted into something less guarded for a moment, and then she carried her box inside. Heart Forward officially incorporated in February. Emma's first act as executive director, a title she'd agreed to after pointing out that Landon's alternative, operational lead, sounded like a military designation, was to contact the remaining names in Dylan's notebooks. Not all of them at once. 3 at a time, working through the list with the care of someone who understood that these weren't projects, they were people. And people required a different approach than projects did. The second entry in the first notebook was a veteran named Carl Beaumont, 61, living outside Waynesburg in a house that had been modified for partial disability access after he'd lost 2 fingers on his right hand and sustained nerve damage to his right leg during his service. The modifications had been done cheaply, more than a decade ago, and had not held up. A ramp to the front entrance that had warped and buckled, a bathroom grab bar that had pulled out of the wall and been replaced with a rope tied to the towel rail, which was its own particular hazard. Dylan's note. Carl doesn't talk about what he needs. He talks about what he's figured out how to manage. There's a difference and most people miss it. They didn't miss it. Emma spent 2 hours with Carl on her first visit, just talking. Not about the house, not about what needed fixing, just talking about his service and his family and the town and the hardware store where he'd worked for 9 years after he got back. She let him direct it. She asked one question about the ramp, just one at the end, and he answered it with more detail than she'd expected because by that point he'd decided she was worth answering honestly. When she came back 2 weeks later with Landon and a licensed contractor named Pete Okafor, whom Landon had found through a contact in his business network, Pete did commercial renovation and had offered his labor at cost when Landon explained what they were doing. Carl met them at the door without the wariness he'd had the first visit. Pete assessed the ramp and the bathroom in 40 minutes and gave a timeline of 1 day for the ramp and 2 hours for the bathroom, assuming the wall behind the towel rail wasn't structurally compromised, which it wasn't. They did it in a Saturday. Carl spent the morning on his front porch watching them work, occasionally asking Pete technical questions that Pete answered at full length because Carl knew what he was talking about. He had a facility with construction that he'd developed over decades of managing his own property because managing his own property was one of the things he'd held on to. At the end of the day, Carl walked down his new ramp, properly sloped, properly anchored, no flex in the surface, and then back up it, and then down again, not because he needed to test it 3 times, but because he could. That's solid work, he said to Pete. Good bones to work with, Pete said, which was generous because the bones had not been good. But Pete had the sense to know when a compliment was more useful than a technical assessment. Carl looked at Emma and Landon standing by the truck. Dylan Hart used to come by, he said, just to check in. I told him I was fine. He kept coming anyway. A pause. He told me once he was going to get the ramp fixed. I told him not to bother. He looked at the ramp. Good thing he didn't listen. He almost never listened when he thought he was right, Emma said. Smart man, Carl said. No. By March, they had completed 4 projects from Dylan's notebooks. Walter's porch, Carl's ramp and bathroom, a furnace replacement for a family of 5 in Uniontown whose heating situation had been exactly what the sideways margin note had described, and a structural repair to a back wall of a house in Carmichael's where a woman named Dorothea Sims was raising 2 grandchildren because her daughter was not able to, and where the back wall had developed a gap that Winter was actively using to make the 2 back bedrooms unusable. The Dorothea Sims project took 3 days and a weekend and required a structural engineer for the assessment phase and a general contractor for the repair, and was the most expensive thing they'd done so far by a significant margin. Landon handled the cost without discussion. Emma handled the coordination, the scheduling, the communication with Dorothea, the management of a woman who was simultaneously grateful and deeply uncomfortable with accepting help, which Emma navigated by involving her in every decision, asking her opinion on materials and timing and approach, until Dorothea had moved from recipient to participant and had stopped looking like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. On the last day of that project, Dorothea's granddaughter, she was 9, named Avery, a narrow, watchful child who had been hovering around the edges of the work all weekend, came and stood next to Emma while she was cleaning up. "Is this your job?" Avery asked. "It is now," Emma said. "Did you do this before?" "A different version of it," Emma said, "with my husband." "Where is he?" Emma kept cleaning up. "He died," she said, "about a year and a half ago." Avery processed this with the directness that children apply to hard facts. "Was he good at building things?" "Better than me at some things. I was better at others." "What were you better at?" "Knowing when something was actually wrong versus when it just looked wrong," Emma said. "Some things look damaged, and they're fine. Some things look fine, and they're damaged. You have to know the difference." Avery thought about this. "How do you learn the difference?" "You look at a lot of things," Emma said. "And you have someone with you who tells you when you're wrong, and you do the same for them." Avery nodded slowly, with the air of someone storing information for later use. "I'm going to be an engineer," she said. "Good," Emma said. "My grandma says I ask too many questions." "Engineers have to ask too many questions," Emma said. "That's the job." Avery appeared satisfied with this. She picked up the broom that Emma had set down and swept the section of floor near the repaired wall with a focus that suggested she had decided to be useful, and Emma let her. Landon, coming in from outside, stopped in the doorway and saw the two of them, Emma checking the wall surface for gaps, Avery sweeping with intent, and didn't interrupt. He stood there for a moment and then went back outside to finish loading the truck. He stood in the cold driveway for a minute. He'd brought Macy to the Dorothea Sims project that morning. The sitter had canceled, and he'd decided, with some uncertainty, to bring her along rather than scramble for an alternative. She'd spent most of the morning in Dorothea's kitchen, having been invited in by Dorothea with the easy hospitality of a woman who understood children and liked them, and the last hour playing in the backyard with Dorothea's other grandchild, a 7-year-old named Jerome, in the way that children play with each other when they have nothing in common except approximate age and access to the same outdoor space, which turns out to be sufficient. On the drive home, Macy had been quiet for a while, which was unusual enough that Landon had asked if she was okay. "Jerome's room was cold," she'd said. "I know, we fixed that." "It was cold before, though," she said. "For a long time?" "Yeah, for a while." She'd been quiet again after that, then, "Did the kids know we were coming to fix it?" "I don't think so. Not until we got there." She'd nodded slowly, the same processing expression she got when she was working through something she didn't quite have the framework for yet. "That's good," she said finally, "that they didn't have to ask." Landon had looked at the road ahead. "Yeah," he said. "That's the whole point." Spring came late to western Pennsylvania that year, grudging, still cold in the mornings, well into April, the trees taking their time with their leaves, the ground staying hard longer than it should. But it came. On a Saturday morning in early April, Landon and Emma drove back to Walter Greer's house with a car trunk full of flower bulbs and a bag of garden tools, because Emma had remembered what Walter said in November about the beds needing digging out, and had remembered what he said about Ruth Eleanor Greer and the afternoon light and the chair at the right end of the porch. Walter was already on the porch when they arrived. In the chair, coffee in hand. The faded sage green of the chair had not changed, and neither had the slight favor he gave his right leg when he stood to greet them, and the tape on the porch light fixture was still there. That was a project for another day. But the porch itself was solid, the railing unmoving under his hand as he stood, the steps without hesitation under his feet as he came down to meet them. "You said spring," he said to Emma. "We said spring," she agreed. He looked at the bulbs. "Tulips?" "Some tulips, some daffodils. A few things that come back every year without much attention." She liked tulips, Walter said. He reached out and picked up one of the bags, handling it before it was offered, the gesture of a man who gives help more naturally than he receives it, and turned back toward the beds along the foundation. "Well, show me where you want them." "It's your garden," Emma said. "I don't know anything about flowers," Walter said. "I just dug." "Then you dig," Emma said. "I'll tell you where." Landon stood at this edge of the front walk with his hands in his pockets, and watched a 74-year-old man and a 30-year-old woman who had both lost the person they loved most in the world kneel down in the cold April ground and start digging holes for tulips in a garden that had been empty for 11 years. He thought about Dylan reading about Walter Greer in conversation at his mother's house, and going home and opening a notebook and writing it down. Writing he won't ask and underlining it twice, and closing the notebook and going on with his Saturday, carrying that small noted obligation forward with the patient intention of someone who fully expected to have time. He thought about the fact that Dylan had written 14 such entries and had not gotten to complete any of them. He thought about the 8 still remaining in the second notebook. He thought about Avery Sims saying, "I'm going to be an engineer," with the certainty of someone stating a plan rather than a hope. He thought about his daughter telling a strange woman moving into their guest house that his house was big because he was sad when it was just him and her, out of the mouth of a 6-year-old who had been listening. Landon crouched down and picked up the second garden tool, a trowel, and went to help with the tulips. Walter looked at him. "You know anything about flowers?" "About as much as I knew about porch repair 6 months ago," Landon said. "Wonderful," Walter said, in a tone that managed to sound both skeptical and not entirely displeased. Emma handed Landon a bag of bulbs and told him how deep to plant them and which end goes up, because apparently that was not self-evident, which he had not known, and the 3 of them worked along the foundation in the cold April morning, digging and planting, and the work was quiet and small and completely without drama. A month later, when the tulips came up, Walter sent Emma a photograph. Just the flowers. No message. No caption. She showed it to Landon without comment. He looked at it for a long moment. Red tulips, bright against the old white siding, the corner of the porch railing visible at the edge of the frame. The railing they'd rebuilt in November, still solid, still plumb. The porch light fixture still had electrical tape on it. They'd have to go back and deal with that. He was already looking forward to it. The photograph of Walter's tulips stayed on Emma's phone for 3 weeks before she made it the first image on Heart Forward's website. She hadn't planned to use it. It was a personal thing. Walter's garden, Ruth Eleanor's flowers, a private exchange between a man and the people who'd shown up when he hadn't asked them to. But when the web designer Landon had contracted asked her for images that represented what the organization actually did, she looked through everything they had: the before and after documentation photos, the group shots from the Carmichael's project, the formal incorporation paperwork photos that nobody needed, and the only image that felt honest was the one Walter had sent. Red tulips against white siding, corner of a rebuilt porch railing at the edge of the frame. No people in it. No story explained. Just evidence that something had been tended. She put it on the home page. Landon saw it when the site went live and didn't comment on the choice, which was itself a comment. He'd learned, over the months of working alongside Emma, that she made decisions with a considered deliberateness that didn't always announce itself, and that questioning them usually revealed a logic she'd already worked through. This was one of the ways they had developed, without discussing it, a functional working relationship. He made the financial and logistical decisions without requiring her sign-off on every line item, and she made the programmatic and community decisions without requiring his approval. And when they disagreed, which happened with some regularity, they argued about it directly and without performance, and one of them was usually right, and occasionally it was genuinely unclear which, and in those cases they tried the thing and found out. It was not a frictionless partnership. It was a functional one, which is different and in most ways more durable. By June, Heart Forward had completed all 14 entries from Dylan's notebooks and was fielding new referrals from the network Emma had spent the spring building. A school counselor in Washington County had connected them with 2 families. A veterans outreach coordinator in Fayette County had sent 3 referrals, 2 of which they'd already addressed. A community health nurse named Gloria Reyes, who worked a territory that covered 6 rural townships and had been doing her job for 22 years and had never had a resource to connect people to for this specific category of need, had called Emma on a Tuesday afternoon and talked for 45 minutes about the situation she saw weekly that fell through every existing gap, and had ended the call by saying that she was going to give Emma's number to every person she visited who needed something that couldn't be provided by the healthcare system. "She's going to bury us," Landon said when Emma told him. "She's going to keep us busy," Emma said, "which is what we need." They took on a part-time coordinator in July, a woman named Prisha Anand, who had a background in nonprofit management and had found the Heart Forward listing through a regional nonprofit job board Landon's attorney had insisted they post to. Prisha was organized in the specific, granular way that people who have spent years managing chaotic systems become organized, not rigid, but systematic, with a memory for details and a talent for maintaining 18 parallel threads without dropping any of them. She was also, Emma discovered within 2 weeks, quietly hilarious in a way that showed up in dry asides during project planning calls and the occasional deadpan email subject line that made you read it twice. The three of them, Landon, Emma, Prisha, became the operational core of Heart Forward's first real year, a triangle that was not always equilateral but held its shape. Landon funded it, not carelessly. He watched the budget with the attention of someone who had built a business by understanding that money is structural, that how it flows determines what can and cannot be sustained. But he funded it at a level that allowed them to say yes more than no, which was what Dylan had intended. He also started pulling in outside donations, quietly, through his business network, not with formal fundraising campaigns, which Emma didn't want to do yet, but through conversations, the kind that happened at dinners and on phone calls, the kind where he'd describe what they were doing and why and let people decide. 3 of his business contacts had made significant contributions by August. A 4th had connected him to a regional foundation that was looking for community-based projects to support. Emma ran the field operations and the community relationships. She drove a lot. She became a familiar presence in parking lots of community centers and church basements and county social services offices across 4 counties, showing up at the places where the people who knew the people were, learning names, following up, doing what she'd told Avery Sims she did, looking at things carefully enough to know the difference between something that looked fine and something that wasn't. She was good at it. She was also, by August, running herself too thin, which Landon noticed before she acknowledged it, and said something about in the way he said things that required saying, directly, without wrapping it in softeners. "You're taking too many initial visits yourself," he said, over a working dinner at the house, which had become a weekly habit on Thursdays, the 3 of them around the kitchen table with project files and food that was usually takeout because none of them had time to cook on Thursdays. "Prisha can do the first assessments. That's what we hired her for." "Prisha is still learning the territory," Emma said. "She's been doing it for 6 weeks. Some of these relationships are delicate." "Emma." He said her name with the specific weight of someone using it as a punctuation mark rather than a greeting. "You drove 400 miles this week." "I know how far I drove." "You're going to burn out before the end of the year." "I'm not going to burn out." Prisha was carefully looking at a project file and not making eye contact with either of them in the particular way of a person who has been on the job long enough to know when to go invisible. "You're doing what Dylan described in the letter," Emma said, and Landon went quiet. "You said he was right that you use work as a wall. You can work and still be present. I can drive 400 miles and still be okay. They're not the same thing." He didn't answer immediately. "I'm allowed to notice when you're tired," he said more quietly. "Yes," Emma said, "you are. And I'm telling you I am tired, and I'm also telling you I'm okay. Those 2 things can both be true." A pause. "All right," he said. "Also," Emma said, returning to the project file, "Prisha should take the Periopolis assessment next week. I'll do the follow-up visit." Prisha made a small sound that might have been either professional acknowledgement or quiet amusement, possibly both. "Fine," Landon said, and took the takeout container that was closest to him, which turned out to be the one Prisha had been planning to take. She accepted the substitution without comment. The Connellsville Recreation Center came into their orbit in September. Emma found it through Gloria Reyes, the community health nurse, who had mentioned it in passing during one of their now regular phone calls. Not as a referral exactly, more as a lament. The way people who work in communities name the things that are broken and that they've stopped expecting to be addressed, because addressing them is too large and complicated and expensive for any single entity to take on. The Connellsville Community Recreation Center had been operating since the 1980s in a building that had not been significantly updated in nearly 30 years. It served a predominantly low-income neighborhood, running after-school programs, a summer day camp for children whose parents couldn't afford alternatives, a senior wellness program 3 days a week, and a food pantry that operated out of what had originally been a storage room and had grown to fill the back half of the ground floor as demand outpaced the space originally designed for it. The building was used by an estimated 300 families in a given month. The building's HVAC system had failed the previous winter, which meant the after-school program had operated in an unheated space from November through February, sustained primarily by space heaters that the director, a woman named Bette Marchand, who had been running the center for 16 years on a salary that reflected the budget rather than the workload, had borrowed from her own house and the houses of 3 board members. The roof had 2 active leaks, documented and patched, and repatching needed. The kitchen used by the food pantry had equipment that was past its service life and failing sequentially in the way that old equipment does, one component at a time. The gymnasium floor had a buckled section from the water intrusion that had been cordoned off with orange cones for 8 months. Bette Marchand had not called Heart Forward. She had not called anyone. She had written 3 grant applications in the past year, been declined on 2, and was still waiting on the 3rd, and was managing the center the way she always managed it, by doing what she could with what she had, which was the only available approach. Gloria had mentioned the center to Emma in the context of talking about the food pantry's reach. She had not asked Emma to do anything about it. Emma drove past it on a route through Connellsville 2 weeks later, on her way to a project assessment for an unrelated referral, and pulled into the parking lot and sat for a few minutes looking at the building. It was a solid building, brick, well-sided, good bones. The kind of building that had been built to last and had lasted, and was now being let down by the inability of the people responsible for it to resource its maintenance, which was a systemic failure, a community failure, not a personal one, but the building didn't know the difference. She called Landon from the parking lot. "I need you to look at something," she said. "I'm in a budget call." "This evening," he paused. "How big?" "Bigger than anything we've done." Another pause. "How much bigger?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why I need you to look at it." He looked at it. Then he had Pete Okafor look at it. Then a structural engineer named Dana Hollis, who Pete recommended, and who turned out to be thorough in the way that the best structural engineers are thorough. She was in that building for 4 hours, going into every space, every mechanical room, every inch of the roof via a hatch in the hallway ceiling, taking photographs and notes and making sounds that ranged from neutral to concerned. Dana's assessment report was 26 pages. Landon read all 26 pages, twice, with a highlighter. The summary? The building was salvageable. The HVAC system needed full replacement. The roof needed complete recover over the 2 compromised sections, approximately 3,000 square feet. The kitchen equipment needed replacing in full, not piecemeal. The gymnasium floor's buckled section was larger than it appeared. The cones covered the visible damage, but the moisture infiltration had spread under the floor to an area twice the visible surface. The electrical panel was a 1987 installation that had been incrementally modified in ways that were not code compliant. The bathrooms were functional, but needed updating for current ADA compliance, which was also a legal exposure for the center. There were 17 things on Dana's list. Some were critical, some were urgent, some were important but could wait. The total estimate for addressing all of them was not small. Landon looked at the number for a long time. He called Emma. "I've read the report," he said. "And?" "It's a lot of money." "I know. More than we've spent on everything combined since we started." "I know," she said again, and he recognized that she'd already worked through this part of the conversation in her head before he called, which was something she did. She processed things in advance so that when the discussion happened, she was already past the obstacle of the number and thinking about the pathway through it. "You want to do it," he said. "This center serves 300 families a month," Emma said. "The food pantry is the primary food access point for about 60 of those families. The after-school program is the reason some of these kids have supervision between 3 and 6 o'clock, which is the window that matters. Bette Marchand has been running it on fumes and grant rejections for 3 years. "I know all of that." "Then you know we should do it." "The foundation's budget?" "I know the budget," Emma said. "We need to raise the rest. We've never done a public campaign. This is probably the right project to do it for. He'd been thinking the same thing and had been reluctant to reach it because public campaigns meant visibility, which meant scrutiny, which meant a level of exposure he'd been comfortable not having. Heart Forward had operated quietly, which he'd preferred. A public fundraising campaign for a project this size changed that. People are going to want to know who's funding this, he said. Yes, Emma said. And when they find out that a billionaire logistics CEO from Crestwood Hills is behind a community foundation serving southwestern Pennsylvania, Emma said, some people are going to be suspicious of it. Some people are going to be moved by the story. Most people are going to care whether the roof gets fixed. You've thought about how to frame it. I've thought about the truth, she said. The truth is that your best friend left a box with his wife, and she drove 3 hours in a storm, and you read a letter and you stopped hiding. That's the story. It's a good one. He was quiet for a moment. He would be deeply annoying about this, Landon said. He would be insufferable, Emma agreed. The word came out easily this time. No crack in it. Just the truth about Dylan, stated plainly, in the way that grief sometimes permits after enough time. Not that the pain is gone, but that the person can be remembered without the remembering being only about the loss. I'll match whatever we raise, Landon said. Dollar for dollar, up to the gap between our current budget and the project total. If we raise half, I cover the rest. You don't have to. I'm not doing it because I have to. A pause. Okay, Emma said. Set up a meeting with Bette Marchand. And don't tell her the scope yet. Let's talk to her first about what she actually needs, not just what the engineer found. Already on my calendar, Emma said. Thursday. He should have known. What? Bette Marchand was 53 and had the specific energy of a woman who had been doing difficult work for a long time and had stopped expecting to be thanked for it without becoming bitter about the absence of thanks, which is a harder equilibrium to maintain than it sounds. She was short and brisk and shook hands like she meant it, and had, on the corner of her desk, a small framed photograph of the center's summer day camp from what looked like 3 or 4 years back. Dozens of children in the gymnasium, mid-activity, blurred with motion. One kid in the center of the frame caught mid-jump, suspended, grinning. She looked at Emma and Landon with the professional wariness of someone who had been visited by well-intentioned people before, people who'd toured the facility and nodded sympathetically and gone back to their lives. Gloria Reyes called me, she said. Said you were coming. She said you were the real thing. She folded her hands on the desk. No offense, but I've been told that before. None taken, Emma said. The HVAC, Bette said, cutting to it, which Landon appreciated. That's what I need most. The kids last winter. She stopped, and the stoppage was brief and controlled, the practiced stop of someone who has learned to manage their own reactions in the presence of new people. We kept going. We made it work. But I'm not doing another winter like that. You won't, Landon said. Betty looked at him the way people look at statements like that when they've learned to weigh them carefully. How certain is that? Certain, he said. She looked at Emma. Emma said, We had a structural engineer assess the building. She identified 17 items that need attention. We're planning to address all of them. Bette was quiet for a moment. All of them, she said. The HVAC first, Emma said, before November. Then the roof, the kitchen, the gymnasium floor, the electrical. There's a timeline in the engineering report we'll share with you. The ADA compliance in the bathrooms too, Landon said. That's a liability issue you don't need. Bette looked at the photograph on the corner of her desk. The children, the blur of motion, the kid mid-jump. She looked at it for a few seconds longer than she needed to. Why? She asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. Landon glanced at Emma. Emma said, My husband used to keep a notebook. He wrote down places and people that needed something done and that nobody was doing. The center wasn't in the notebook, but everything that brought us here, the way we work, why we started, comes from him. She paused. He believed that the reason things don't get fixed isn't usually because nobody cares. It's because caring and doing are two different things. and the distance between them is where most good intentions live and die. Bet looked at her for a long moment. Your husband, she said. He passed? A couple of years ago. I'm sorry. She said it simply, and meant it simply, the way Walter Greer had said it, without ornament. Thank you, Emma said. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a room where something honest has been said. Then Bet straightened in her chair and picked up a pen and said, All right, tell me about this timeline. And they spent the next 2 hours going through the engineering report item by item, while Betty asked sharp, specific questions, and took her own notes and occasionally corrected something Dana Hollis had observed from the outside that Bet knew differently from 16 years on the inside. When they left, Betty walked them to the parking lot. The kid in the photograph, she said at the door. On my desk? Mid-jump. We noticed, Landon said. His name is Marcus. He was 8 in that picture. He's 12 now. He's been in this building almost every weekday for 4 years. She looked at the building. He does his homework in the corner of the gym where the floor is still flat. He sits there every day and does his homework and then plays basketball until his mother picks him up at 6. She paused. I need this building to keep being the place it needs to be for kids like Marcus. That's the whole thing. We know, Emma said. Bet nodded. She went back inside. Quote, the fundraising campaign launched in October, 6 weeks after the Bet Marchand meeting, and was not glamorous. There was no gala. There was no celebrity attachment. There was a website page with a photo of the center, Dana Hollis's assessment summary rewritten in plain language, a clear breakdown of where every donated dollar would go, and a short account of Heart Forward's origins. Dylan's notebooks, the blue box, the storm, the porch, written by Emma and edited 3 times until it said exactly what she wanted and nothing more. Landon shared it through his business network. Emma shared it through every community contact she'd built over the past year. Gloria Reyes shared it with every organization she was connected to, which turned out to be a substantial network. The school district in which the center operated shared it in their parent newsletter. A local radio station in Uniontown ran a segment because a producer there had gone to the center as a child and had not thought about it in 15 years and called Bet after seeing the campaign and ended up doing a 20-minute on-air piece that was unpolished and genuine and reached more people than anything else they did. Pete Okafor donated his labor for the HVAC installation. He'd been billing Heart Forward at cost since Carl Beaumont's ramp, and when Emma had called him about the center and explained the scope, he'd gone quiet for a moment and then said he'd do the HVAC work for materials only. You've got a business to run, Emma had said. I've got a crew that I pay well and a schedule I control, Pete said, and I grew up in Connellsville, 2 blocks from that center. He paused. I didn't say anything earlier because I didn't know if it was relevant. It's relevant, Emma said. Pete brought 4 of his crew for 2 weeks in November. The HVAC system went in on schedule, which was not always true of projects this size and this complexity. And when it was done, Pete had it running for 3 days before the first hard frost of the year and stood in the gymnasium with Bet and Emma and watched the temperature gauge and did not say anything sentimental about it because he wasn't that kind of man, but he checked the gauge twice and both times he nodded in a way that said enough. By the time November ended, the campaign had raised just over half the project total. Landon matched it. The roof and kitchen work began in December, scheduled to complete before the new year. And through all of it, the fundraising calls, the contractor scheduling, the supply chain management that Landon handled with the same instincts he'd built a logistics company on, now applied to 2x4s and HVAC units and kitchen equipment. The thing that kept pulling at Landon. The thing he kept returning to in the quiet of the evenings when Macy was asleep and the house was still, was something Bet Marchand had said in the parking lot. I need this building to keep being the place it needs to be. Not be fixed. Not be improved, not be transformed, be the place it needed to be. Present tense, continuous. He understood, in a way he hadn't fully articulated before, that this was what Dylan had been writing toward in those notebooks. Not charity, not philanthropy in the abstract sense, not the version of generosity that happens at a distance and feels nothing. The specific, particular maintenance of what holds communities together. The invisible architecture of places where people who have nothing else to fall back on can fall back on something. You couldn't do that with a check. You could start with a check, but the check wasn't the point. Showing up was the point. Learning what the place actually needed rather than what you assumed it needed. Standing in Bet's parking lot and listening to her talk about a 12-year-old doing his homework on the part of the floor that was still flat. He thought about the letter. Stop surviving and start living. He didn't think he'd been surviving exactly since October when Emma had knocked on his door. He'd been doing something, building something, something that was real and that mattered and that was not armor around a wound but an actual external growing thing. But he also knew, and this was the harder knowledge, the one he turned over at night, that he'd been doing it at a distance from himself, managing it, funding it, coordinating it with the same precise operational intelligence he used to run Pierce Logistics. The emotion was real, but he'd been keeping it on the other side of a pane of glass, feeling it without letting it land. The moment it landed was not during the HVAC installation. It was not at the Bet Marchand meeting. It was on a Tuesday in November when Emma asked him to come to the center because they needed someone to help move the pantry shelving from the storage room to the new configuration they were setting up in preparation for the kitchen renovation, which was unglamorous physical work with no strategic dimension, just moving shelves. He went. He moved shelves. And somewhere around the middle of the afternoon, taking a break, he found himself standing in the gymnasium where a handful of kids who were in the after-school program were doing homework at folding tables while a supervisor helped two of them with something. And in the corner, the part of the floor that was still flat, a boy was sitting alone with a notebook and a pencil, head down, working. He was 12 or so. Narrow, careful, focused. Landon stood at the edge of the gym and looked at the cordoned-off section of buckled floor, the orange cones, the months of working around, and then at the corner where the boy sat in the flat space. He stood there for a moment, long enough to feel something he couldn't arrange at a distance. Then he went back to moving shelves. But the glass had cracked a little. He didn't tell Emma about it. He didn't need to. She was moving shelves too, on the other side of the room, and she was there, and they were both there. And that was the thing Dylan had meant, and they both already knew it, and some things don't need to be said. They just need to be done. Gym. The gymnasium floor was the last thing to be completed, mid-January, after the new year. The crew Pete had recommended for the floor work spent 4 days on it, removing the damaged section, treating the subfloor, laying new maple over the full gym surface because the existing maple was old enough that matching it was not possible, and they'd made the decision to redo the whole floor rather than leave a visible patch. It cost more. It was the right call. On the last day of the floor work, Bet Marchand walked the full length of the gym on the new surface and then did something that Pete's crew watched with the careful peripheral attention of workers who have learned not to stare but don't want to miss things. She stopped at the corner where the cones had been, the space that had been the only flat part for 8 months, and she stood there for a moment, looking at the floor. No cones, no boundary, just floor, continuous and sound, from one end to the other. She turned around. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Emma confirmed. Bet looked at the length of the gym, at the new surface, the clean lines, the unmarked expanse of maple that went all the way to the wall. "Marcus is going to want to move his homework spot," she said. "He can sit anywhere he wants," Pete said. "That's going to confuse him," Bet said, with the dry affection of someone who knows a specific child well. "He's been sitting in that corner for 4 years. He'll figure it out," Emma said. Bet smiled. Not the careful professional smile she'd used in their first meeting. A real one, the kind that changes the whole face, the kind you can't manage on purpose. The orange cones were gone. The floor was whole. Heart Forward had done a lot of things in its first year. This was not the largest of them in square footage or dollar amount. But standing in that gymnasium, Landon felt the specific weight of what had been built. Not the floor, not the building, but the accumulated meaning of all of it, project by project, name by name, Walter's railing and Carl's ramp and Dorothea's wall and the furnace in Uniontown and 14 entries in 2 composition notebooks and 30-something referrals since, and a campaign that had asked for help and found it. Because it turned out that when you showed people something real and specific, something with a name and a face and a 12-year-old doing his homework in the only flat corner, people gave a damn. They always had. They just needed to know where to look. Marcus did move his homework spot. Better reported this to Emma in a text message 3 days after the gymnasium floor was completed, with no additional context, just, "He sat in the middle today." Took him a while to decide, stayed there the whole time. Emma read it standing in the Heart Forward office, which was now an actual office, a converted room in a building Landon had leased in Canonsburg, with 2 desks and a filing system Prisha had built from scratch, and a whiteboard that was never not covered in project timelines. And she read it twice, and then set her phone face down on the desk and sat quietly for a moment before she went back to what she'd been doing. She didn't tell Landon about it that day. She told him a week later, in passing, and he listened and didn't say anything for a moment, and then said, "Good," and went back to the budget spreadsheet he'd been reviewing. It was enough. Some things only need one word, and the right one is usually short. The second year of Heart Forward moved faster than the first, the way second years always do when you've spent the first one building the infrastructure that makes speed possible. Prisha had hired a second part-time coordinator by March, a young man named Devon Osai, 26, a recent social work graduate who had grown up in Fayette County and knew the territory the way you know places you've come from, with the specific knowledge of proximity rather than the learned knowledge of professional exposure. Devon drove old back roads in a 10-year-old Honda that he kept running through a combination of mechanical intuition and stubborn optimism, and he brought referrals from corners of the county that the existing network hadn't reached. He also had the quality, rarer than people assumed, of knowing when not to talk. When to sit with someone in their living room and let the silence do the work of telling him what the words weren't saying yet. Emma recognized it in him on his 3rd field visit and told Landon that Devon was the best hire they'd made, which was a significant statement given that Prisha had rebuilt the organization's internal systems from a spreadsheet and a collection of Post-it notes in the span of a month. "He listens the way Dylan did," Emma said. Landon looked at her. "I know," she said, before he could say whatever he was going to say. "I know what I said." And he let it go because she wasn't wrong, and because some comparisons are made not to diminish the original, but to locate something good in the world that continues. By the spring of the second year, Heart Forward had completed 41 projects across 5 counties. 19 families, 11 veterans, 6 community spaces, including the Connellsville Center. 4 individuals living alone, like Walter Greer, in houses that had been quietly failing around them for years while they adapted and managed and did not ask. The projects ranged from a single afternoon of work to the 3-month renovation of the recreation center. The total dollar amount spent would have bought Landon a moderately priced vacation property, which was the comparison he made once to himself and then immediately recognized as a useful piece of perspective. He started giving that perspective publicly. He had resisted, through the first year, any kind of personal visibility for the organization beyond what the campaign for the recreation center had required. His name was on the incorporation documents and on the Heart Forward website as founder, but he had declined 2 interview requests from regional press and deflected a profile inquiry from a Pittsburgh business magazine that wanted to write about the philanthropy angle of a logistics CEO's nonprofit venture because the framing was wrong. It was not a philanthropy angle, it was not a CEO does good story, and he was not going to let Dylan's notebooks become content for a magazine profile about wealth and generosity. But something shifted in the spring, and the shift came from an unexpected direction. Macy was 7 by then, and had become a quiet but consistent presence at Heart Forward events and project sites. Not every weekend, not structured around her schedule in any way that made her responsible for the work, but present in the way that children are present when the adults in their lives are doing something real, absorbing it without being asked to, making it part of their understanding of how the world works. She had helped plant tulips at Walter's house. She had sat in Dorothea Sims's kitchen and eaten cookies. She had played with Jerome in the backyard and with Avery Sims, who had decided, apparently, to maintain contact with Emma because she found Emma interesting, and who now occasionally appeared in the Heart Forward office on Saturday mornings when Dorothea dropped her off to spend time with Emma while Dorothea ran errands, which had evolved from a logistical convenience into something that looked remarkably like mentorship if you use that word, or just looked like 2 people who found each other good company if you didn't. Avery was still planning to be an engineer. She had been reading about structural engineering specifically, which she'd decided was the right kind after a conversation with Pete Okafor, who had showed up to the office one afternoon to go over materials costs with Emma and ended up spending 45 minutes talking to Avery about load-bearing calculations in residential construction because she had asked the right question, and he was the kind of man who answered right questions fully. On a Saturday morning in April, Landon was in the office working on the budget for the third quarter when Macy came in from the back room where she'd been drawing and set a piece of paper on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. She had drawn 2 buildings, one on the left that was clearly meant to be collapsing, with a crooked roof and walls that were tilted, and one on the right that was straight and solid, with flowers along the bottom. In between the buildings, she had drawn 3 stick figures, and above the whole thing she had written, in the careful block letters of a child who has been practicing her handwriting, "Heart forward fixes things." Below the buildings she had added, apparently as an afterthought, smaller and slightly less neat, "and people too." Landon looked at the drawing for a long time. "Can I keep this?" he said. "It's for the office," she said, with the tone of someone presenting a commissioned work. "Emma can put it up." He had it framed. Emma hung it above the whiteboard. It was still there, technically, alongside a steadily accumulating collection of photographs and thank you cards, and 2 hand-drawn pictures from Dorothea's grandchildren, and a crayon drawing of a porch from a child whose name they didn't know, who had pressed it into Emma's hand at a project site in Greene County, apparently on the basis of having observed that Emma liked porches. The profile article ran in June of the second year in a regional magazine that covered community business across southwestern Pennsylvania, and it was written by a journalist named Carol Pena, who had found Heart Forward through the Connellsville campaign, and had spent 3 months quietly attending project sites and talking to people before approaching Landon for the interview. He'd said yes, not because the profile angle had changed. It hadn't. It was still a story about a wealthy man doing community work, which was not the story, but because Carol had found the actual story anyway, without his participation, and he'd rather tell it correctly than let it be told around him. The article focused on Dylan, on the notebooks, on Emma driving 3 hours in a storm, on Walter Greer's tulips and Bette Marchand's gymnasium floor, and the 14 entries that had become 41 completed projects, and a network of referrals and 5 county partnerships, and a staff of 4, and a budget that was now supported by a combination of Landon's personal contributions, regional foundation grants, and a growing roster of individual donors who had found the organization through word of mouth. Landon was in the article, clearly, prominently, but as a supporting character in a story whose protagonist was a man who had sat at his kitchen table on a Saturday morning in March, 2.5 years before his death, and written down the things he meant to do. The headline was Carol's. Landon hadn't seen it until the piece was published. And it was, "Forward, then figure it out. How a dead man's notebooks built something he never got to see." It was the right headline. He read it alone in the kitchen at 6 in the morning before anyone else was up, with coffee, and he got to the end of the piece and sat for a while in the early light, coming through the valley windows. The same windows he'd been standing at the night Emma knocked, a 1.5 years ago. Watching storm darkness and feeling the particular emptiness of a life that had the shape of fullness without the weight of it. The valley was clear now. June morning, the ridgeline distinct, the green of the hills full and definite. He had not fixed himself. That wasn't what had happened. He was still a man who defaulted to logistics when he was uncomfortable, who used competence as a social strategy, who had to consciously remind himself to sit with Macy without his phone in his hand, who still occasionally woke at 3 in the morning turning over a supply chain problem or a budget shortfall rather than a personal feeling, because feelings were harder to solve and he had never liked problems he couldn't solve. He was still those things. But he was also the man who had shown up at Walter Greer's house on a cold November Saturday with the wrong lumber and a toolbox from the internet, and had gone back the next Saturday and the next, and had planted tulips in the spring and received a photograph of them without a caption and understood exactly what it meant. He was both. He was working on the balance. In July of the second year, they got a letter, not an email, an actual letter, handwritten, in an envelope addressed to Hart Forward at the Canonsburg office, with a return address in Uniontown. Emma opened it because she opened all the mail. She read it standing at the desk, and then she sat down. The letter was from a woman named Patricia Holloway, 68, who wrote to say that Hart Forward had replaced her furnace 18 months ago. She was the family in Uniontown from Dylan's notebooks, the one Emma had described from the sideways margin note in the second notebook. Winter is coming and the furnace is old and she won't ask, and that she had wanted to write for a long time but had not known what to say exactly, and had decided that not knowing what to say was less important than saying something, so she was saying something. She said that the winter before Hart Forward had come. She had not told her adult children how bad the heating situation was, because she didn't want them to worry, and because she'd been managing on her own for 14 years since her husband passed, and she had a strong conviction, possibly irrational, that continuing to manage on her own was something she owed him. She had used electric space heaters and extra blankets and had not complained and had told herself it was fine. It was not fine. She knew that now. She'd had a respiratory illness that winter, secondary to the cold, that she'd also not told her children about, and that had taken 3 months to fully resolve. The new furnace had changed things she hadn't expected to change, not just the temperature of the house. Something about knowing the house was warm without effort. Something about not calculating the cold into every morning. She hadn't known how much of her daily mental energy had been going toward managing the problem until the problem was gone and the energy was suddenly available for other things. She'd started a reading group at the Uniontown Library. 3 mornings a week, 11 members. They were reading their way through a list she'd compiled herself. She thought they should know that. She signed it, sincerely and with genuine gratitude, Patricia Holloway. P.S. I told my daughter about the furnace. She was upset with me for not asking for help. I told her I came by it honestly. She said that wasn't a compliment. She was right. Emma sat with the letter for a long time. She brought it to the Thursday dinner that week, which had continued as a weekly institution through the second year, still takeout, still the kitchen table. Though Prisha had joined as a regular attendee and Devin came when he wasn't in the field, and Macy now stayed up for the first half of it because she'd made a persuasive case at some point that 7:30 was too early for bed, and she was willing to go at 8:15 if she could sit at the table, which she spent mostly drawing or reading, but also listening. Emma set the letter on the table next to the takeout containers. "Read that," she said. Landon read it. Prisha read it. Devin read it. Macy asked what it was, and Emma said it was a letter from someone whose furnace they'd fixed. And Macy said, "Oh, was she cold?" And Emma said yes. And Macy nodded with the gravity of someone for whom cold houses had become a real and concrete problem in the world, rather than an abstraction. Landon set the letter down. "She started a reading group," he said. 11 people, Emma said, "because her furnace works." "Because her furnace works," Emma said. "Because she has the energy for something besides managing the cold." Nobody said anything for a moment. Devin was looking at the letter with the expression he got when something had confirmed something he already believed, which was not a satisfied expression exactly, more a weighing expression, as if adding the evidence to a scale that was important to keep accurate. "This is what Dylan meant," Emma said. "He didn't write fix their furnace so they stay warm. He wrote it like it was the beginning of something, like the furnace was just the door." She looked at the table. "We've been thinking about the projects as the outcomes. They're not. They're the conditions. We create the conditions, and people create the outcomes themselves." "We always knew that," Prisha said, not dismissively, just placing it. "I knew it," Emma said. "I know it differently now." Landon picked up the letter again and looked at the postscript. The bit about Patricia's daughter, and the bit about coming by it honestly, and the acknowledgement, her own, that her daughter was right to challenge her. He thought about his conversation with Emma in the truck 8 months ago, when he told her she was driving 400 miles a week, and she'd told him the difference between being tired and not being okay. He thought about the way she'd named what he was doing, using her exhaustion as a mirror for his own patterns, and had been neither cruel nor gentle about it, just honest. He thought about Macy saying the house was big because he was sad. Honesty from the people you trust is not comfortable. It is, however, extremely useful, and he had come over the past 18 months to value it In Emma, the way you value something that costs something, precisely because it costs something. I want to respond to her, Landon said, meaning Patricia Holloway. I already wrote back, Emma said. What did you say? I told her the reading group was the whole point. He nodded. I also told her, Emma said, about the person who wrote it down, Dylan, who noticed her situation and wrote it in a notebook and meant to come. She didn't know that, Landon said. She does now, Emma said. It felt like she should know that someone had seen her before we got there, that someone had noticed. He thought about that, about the specific thing it means to be seen by someone, before anything has been done, before any help has arrived. Just noticed, just registered as a person whose situation matters, in someone's mind, in a notebook, in the margin between other notes. Patricia Holloway had spent a winter cold and alone and not asking, and before anyone arrived with a solution, Dylan Hart had written her name down. It didn't fix the furnace, but it was not nothing. He said, he would have liked knowing that. Yes, Emma said. He would have, sus. In September of the second year, Emma moved out of the guest house. She had found an apartment in Canonsburg, close to the office, second floor of a building that had been renovated recently, a landlord who was responsive about maintenance, which she had learned to require rather than hope for. It was small, one bedroom, with a window that looked out over the street, and she had furnished it in the specific spare way of someone who had spent time living with less and discovered that less was not as bad as she'd feared. She told Landon on a Wednesday, 2 weeks before the move, in the office, practical and forward-facing, the rent, the location, the date. He said, "That's good. That makes sense," which it did. She had been in the guest house for 8 months, which was well past the transitional period they'd originally discussed, and staying longer served a convenience rather than a necessity, and Emma was not someone who confused convenience with reason. He helped her move on a Saturday. Prisha came too, and Devin, because Devin had a truck, and because moving things was Devin's default response to any situation that required action rather than conversation. Macy came because she came to most things on Saturdays now, and because she had taken a decisive interest in Emma's move, specifically in the question of where Emma's books would go. "You have a lot of books," Macy told Emma, in the new apartment, looking at the boxes. "I do," Emma agreed. "More than us. Daddy has books, but they're mostly business." "Books are how I think," Emma said. Macy considered this. "I think with drawing." "I know," Emma said. "That's a good way to think." "What do the books help you think about?" Emma was unpacking a box, stacking books on the floor by category while she figured out the shelving. "People," she said. "Mostly. Why they do the things they do. What they're trying to hold on to." "Do you know?" Macy asked. "After reading all the books?" Emma looked at the pile on the floor. "A little better than before," she said. "Not all the way." "Daddy says nobody knows all the way," Macy said. "He's right. He says that's okay because you don't need to know all the way to still do something." Emma looked at Macy for a moment with an expression that Landon, who was carrying a box past the doorway at that moment, caught the edge of, and which he could not entirely name, except that it was warm and a little unguarded, and was the expression of someone receiving something they hadn't expected from a direction they hadn't looked. He kept walking with the box. He set it in the kitchen and stood for a moment with his hands on the counter. He was not going to make more of the morning than it was. Emma was moving into her own apartment, which was the right thing, and they were helping, and Macy had said something smart that 7-year-olds sometimes say, and none of that was a watershed moment. It was just a Saturday morning in September, moving boxes. He was still working on the balance. The part of him that managed things from a distance was still there. He still noticed it operating, still caught himself retreating into the logistics of situations to avoid their emotional weight. He was getting better at catching it, getting better, by increments, at staying in the room. He went back for another box. The second envelope arrived in October. Emma found it. She had been going through the blue box, which lived in the Heart Forward office now, on a shelf above Emma's desk, because that was where it belonged, looking for the original address she'd noted on a scrap inside for a referral follow-up. She'd been through the box many times. She knew its contents the way you know the contents of something you've handled over and over until its weight and dimensions are familiar. The envelope was at the bottom, below where the composition notebooks had been, flat against the green velvet lining, its cream color almost the same as the lining's faded edge. She had not seen it before. It was possible she'd always somehow missed it in the way you miss things that are in plain sight when you're not looking for them specifically. It was also possible that it had been there the whole time, waiting for the moment when she went looking for something else and found it instead. Her name was on the front. Not Landon's name. Hers. Emma, in Dylan's handwriting. Just that. She sat down. She did not open it immediately. She sat with it for about 5 minutes, which was different from the paralysis of the storage unit. This was not inability to open it, but the specific decision to be ready first. She had learned the difference between avoidance and preparation. They looked similar from the outside. She opened it. The letter inside was 1 page. Not 4 pages like Landon's, but 1, written on both sides. Dylan's handwriting slightly smaller than usual, as if he'd been trying to fit more into less space than he'd allowed himself. She read it. Then she read it again. Then she put it back in the envelope, sat with it for a moment, and called Landon. "Can you come to the office?" "I'm in the middle of—" "Please." He was there in 20 minutes. She had the letter on the desk when he arrived. She watched him see the envelope and register the handwriting and register the name on the front. And she watched the small change in his face that happened whenever Dylan's handwriting appeared. A brief tightening, a settling, the face of someone receiving something from a direction they thought had gone permanently silent. "It was in the box," she said, "at the bottom. I don't know how I missed it." "Did you read it?" "Yes." He looked at the envelope. "What does it say?" She picked it up and held it for a moment. "He wrote it separately," she said. "From yours. Different time. The handwriting is different, more careful, like he was taking more time with it." She paused. "He wrote about the first year after we were married, what it was like to have someone who actually knew him. He said—" She stopped. "He said he'd been a person who moved through life doing things and not stopping to receive anything back. He said, I taught him to receive, that I was the person who taught him it was okay to need things." Landon was very still. "And then he said," Emma continued, and her voice was steady, carefully steady, the way you hold something fragile, "that if I was reading this, it meant he hadn't gotten to do the things he planned, and that I was probably still trying to carry everything myself, the way I did before him. And that I should find the people who show up, not who mean to show up, who actually do." She set the letter down. "He said he knew someone who would show up," she said. "He said he'd arranged it, more or less, as best he could from where he was." The office was quiet. Outside, the October street was ordinary. A car passing, someone's dog, the particular light of a fall afternoon that had given up warmth but retained brightness. Landon looked at the letter on the desk. "He was planning it," Landon said, "the whole time, not just the notebooks." "He was Dylan," Emma said. "He planned everything. He just didn't tell you he was planning because you would have argued with him." "I would have." "And he would have been right anyway." Landon looked at her. "Yeah," he said. "He would have." They sat with that for a moment. The weight of a man who had thought carefully about the people he loved and done what he could to arrange for their continued well-being from a distance he did not expect but somehow intuited. Not from certainty. He'd been 30 years old and healthy, and had written the letter the same spring he'd written in the notebooks, the spring after the health scare that turned out to be nothing. He had not known. He'd simply understood that knowing was not the prerequisite for caring, and had acted on that understanding. Emma refolded the letter and set it back in the envelope. "He was right," she said. "About you. You showed up." "You knocked on my door," Landon said. "That required more." "I knocked on your door because he told me there was someone worth knocking for," Emma said. "That's different from showing up." "I had the instruction. You showed up without one." He hadn't thought of it that way. He turned it over. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked, meaning the letter. "Keep it," she said. "With his." She opened the blue box and placed the envelope inside, next to the folded letter that had started all of this, and closed the lid. The box sat on the shelf above her desk, where it had been for a year, and where it would stay. But Heartforward's third year began without ceremony. There was no anniversary event, no milestone celebration. Prisha had suggested one, and Emma had considered it and decided against it, on the grounds that the work was not finished, and pausing to celebrate an anniversary felt like the kind of thing that was more about the organization's sense of itself than about anything useful to anyone they were trying to help. She said this directly to Prisha, who heard it and said she understood, and also that they should at least get dinner, and Emma had agreed that dinner was acceptable. They got dinner. All of them, including Devin and Pete Okafor and Gloria Reyes and Bet Marchand, and because Landon brought her Masi, who sat next to Bet, and asked detailed questions about the recreation center that Bet answered at full length. At some point in the evening, Marcus came up in conversation. Bet mentioned something he'd said that week, some observation about the gym, and Devin asked who Marcus was, and Betty described him, and the table listened, and Landon looked at Macy next to Bet and thought about all the ways things connect that you can't plan. Walter Greer sent a card. He was not a dinner person, he had explained to Emma when she'd extended the invitation, and she had said that was completely fine and she would stop by with something. And he had said not to bother, it was just dinner, but the card arrived the next week and said, "You've done good work." Ruth would have said more. "I'll say good work." Signed with his name and nothing else. Emma pinned it to the board in the office next to Macy's drawing. The red tulips in the photograph below it had faded slightly on the printed paper, the way photographs do over time, but the image was still clear. The flowers against the white siding, the corner of the railing at the edge of the frame. It had been 2 years since the storm. 2 years since Emma Hart had driven 3 hours with a blue box on the passenger seat and stood on a stranger's porch in the rain and knocked 3 times, uncertain, and not turned back. 2 years since Landon Pierce had opened his door and seen the paint color on a box in a stranger's arms and felt the cold in his neck that had nothing to do with the weather. What those 2 years had built was not what either of them would have predicted standing in that doorway. They had not predicted each other, exactly. Not the specific way they'd found a working rhythm, not the way Emma's directness had become something Landon relied on, not the way Landon's operational precision had become something Emma built her work around. They had not predicted Prisha or Devin or Pete or Gloria or Bet or Avery or Patricia Holloway and her reading group. They had not predicted 41 projects becoming 70, or the regional foundation grant that came through in the third year's second quarter, or the call from a county commissioner who had read Carol Pena's article and wanted to discuss a partnership on housing stability initiatives. They had not predicted any of the specifics, but Dylan had predicted the shape of it. He'd seen, from the vantage point of someone who loved 2 people and knew them both clearly and had written things down while he still could, that these were 2 people who needed something to be in the world that was larger than their grief, and that they were capable of building it, and that the building would matter not because it was grand, but because it was specific. Specific. That was Dylan's whole philosophy, written between the lines of 14 notebook entries and 2 letters and 1 PS about concrete footings. Not help people in general. Help the man at 412 Fenwick Road whose porch was rotting and who had put his wife's chair in the garage. Not support communities. Fix the gymnasium floor so a 12-year-old can sit anywhere he wants. Not do good. Show up. With the wrong lumber if necessary. Figure it out from there. Landon understood this now, not as a philosophy, but as a practice, as something he did with his hands and his time and his actual presence, every weekend that he drove to a project site and every Thursday evening at the kitchen table, and every morning he dropped Macy at school and came back to the office and sat down and worked on the things that mattered and did not use the work as a place to hide. He was still working on the balance. He expected he would be for a while. That was not failure. That was just what being a person looked like if you were paying honest attention. Emma understood it differently, the way she understood most things, from the inside rather than the overhead view, from the texture of it rather than the structure. She understood it as the continuation of something Dylan had started, something that had not ended with him but had changed form, the way things change form when they pass from one set of hands to another. She carried the notebooks, both of them, all the entries, all the margins, not as a burden, but as a compass. Where they pointed was always toward the specific person, the specific need, The specific repair that was also not only a repair, the grief was still there. She did not expect it to disappear, and was wary of the version of healing that advertised disappearance. What it had done was change its character. From the acute kind, the kind that ambushes you in grocery stores and at the sight of handwriting, to the chronic kind, the kind that is simply part of the landscape of yourself, present without always being central. She could talk about Dylan without the word insufferably cracking in the middle of it. She could open the blue box without having to prepare. She could look at the photograph of the two men squinting in the sun on a gravel road north of Punxsutawney and feel the loss, and also feel something else at the same time, something that had no single name. She was okay. She knew the difference now between okay and fine. Dylan had made her learn that distinction stubbornly over the years, refusing to accept fine as a real answer. Okay was real. Okay meant, I am still here, I am still moving, some things are hard and some things are good, and I am paying attention to both. She was okay. Landon was getting there. Macy, by 7, had become a person who asked the right questions and remembered names and drew buildings. Always buildings, houses and porches and gymnasiums, the occasional flower garden, and had absorbed, without being taught it directly, something about the relationship between showing up and mattering. She would carry that into her life in whatever form it took, and it would probably not look like what they were doing, because the point was never the form. The point was the understanding underneath. They were not a family exactly. They were something for which the available words were imprecise. They were people who showed up for each other and for others, and who were honest when it was hard and present when it cost something. Dylan had seen that this was possible, had seen it in them both before they could see it in themselves, and had written it down and had trusted that the writing would outlast him and find its way to the right hands. It had. The blue box sat on the shelf above Emma's desk in the Heart Forward office in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania. Inside it, 2 letters, 2 composition notebooks with soft edges, 1 photograph of 2 young men squinting into the sun, and the particular blue paint of someone who had mixed that color himself in a garage in Morgantown when he was 19 years old and had used it for everything he made with his hands because he liked the way it looked, which was reason enough. The notebooks were full. They had started new ones.